Hey friend! Yes, you wrapped up somewhere warm and quiet right now. I am glad you found your way back here tonight, whatever kind of day you just had. Get comfortable, because where we are going tonight is somewhere the sun has not touched in 300 million years. Picture something longer than your front door is tall, covered head to tail in armor, moving slowly through wet, dark soil under a strange old moon. Now picture it walking the earth 300 million years before the first dinosaur ever took a breath, and never needing to hunt a single thing to survive. This is not a monster somebody made up for a story. This truly happened, and tonight we are going back to see it for ourselves. But before we step into that ancient dark together, if this kind of story is the sort of thing that helps you unwind, would you take just a moment to tap that like button, hit subscribe, and maybe leave a small comment below? It costs nothing, and it tells me you would enjoy more nights like this one. And honestly, I am always curious. Where are you tonight? Curled up in bed after a long day, riding home on a late train with your phone propped up somewhere safe, already half asleep, fighting to keep your eyes open. I would love to know when and where you found this video, or even just a kind word if you are enjoying it so far. All right, let's get you settled in. Turn the lights down low if you can, maybe click on a soft fan or a little background hum, pull something warm over your shoulders, and let's slip quietly into a night that happened long before anyone was counting nights at all. The year does not matter because nobody was counting years yet. What mattered was the air itself. Thick, warm, almost sweet, with the smell of wet green growth and old soft wood. Step into this forest with me quietly and let your eyes adjust to the dark. Above you trees rise taller than anything you have ever stood beneath. Not oak, not pine. These are older cousins of the tiny moss you might find growing on a stone outside your home, except here they climb hundreds of feet into the sky, their bark patterned like the scales of a fish, their branches ending in soft green tufts that sway ever so gently, even when the air feels almost still. Between the trunks, ferns the size of small trucks stretch open like green hands, catching whatever pale light manages to slip through the canopy above. The ground beneath your feet, if you were standing here, is not really ground at all. It is soft, spongy, and endless. Dead leaves, fallen branches, and moss have been piling up in this one spot for longer than anybody could count, layer after layer slowly turning into something dark and rich. One day, many millions of years from this very night, people will dig this material out of the earth and burn it to keep their homes warm. They will call it coal, but tonight it is simply the forest floor, quietly forming one fallen leaf at a time. There is no grass here, not one blade, no flowers either, not a single petal anywhere in this entire forest, because neither one has been invented by nature quite yet. Instead, fine pale spores drift down through the humid air, every so often settling on your shoulders like a strange gentle snow carried from somewhere high above where these ancient trees quietly reproduce one dusty cloud at a time. A thin mist curls low along the ground, catching in the ferns, drifting between the trunks like slow silver smoke. The air feels thicker here than the air you're breathing right now, heavier somehow, almost as if it were carrying a little more of everything a lung could ever want. We will talk more about that later, but for tonight, just notice how full and warm each breath feels as it settles in your chest. Try to hold that thought for a moment. This is happening before the Rocky Mountains ever pushed themselves up out of the ground. Before the Grand Canyon began carving itself out of solid rock, one slow drop of water at a time. Whatever you think of as old, this forest was already ancient long before that kind of old even began. Somewhere above your head something buzzes past low and heavy like a small aircraft cutting through the thick humid air. If you could see it clearly, you would notice its wings stretch wider than a dinner plate, nearly 2 feet from tip to tip. It is not a bird. Birds do not exist yet and will not for a very long while still. This is simply a very large, very old cousin of the dragonfly, and it will not bother you tonight. It has other things to hunt. If you could somehow pull back far enough to see this whole scene from above, you would find that this forest is not some small hidden pocket of green. Swamps exactly like this one stretch on and on, covering an enormous share of the ancient world in places that will one day become the coal fields of Pennsylvania, Illinois, and Kentucky, and just as easily the quiet green counties of England, where pieces of a creature very much like this one were first pulled out of the ground, wrapped in stone well over a century ago. Wherever you happen to be watching this from tonight, there is a decent chance a forest like this one once stood somewhere beneath you too. Near your feet, something else stirs in the leaf litter, small pale with a curled tail held high. For half a second your heart might skip, but watch closely and you will notice it is barely the length of your hand, more curious than dangerous, scuttling sideways under a fallen branch to hide from something far bigger than either of you. Out here, even the frightening things have their own things to be frightened of. Funny how that works, isn't it? The thing that would send you running in your own backyard is out here just another small nervous creature trying to find a quiet corner to hide in for the night, same as everyone else. And then from beneath a fallen log thick with pale fungus, something begins to move. At first it looks like the log itself is shifting. A long, dark, segmented shape unrolling out of the shadows, plate after plate of hard, shining armor catching the faint light. Leg after leg after leg, more than you could ever finish counting, ripple beneath its body in one slow, steady rhythm, almost like water flowing gently uphill. This is Arthropleura, and when fully grown, its body will stretch past 8 feet longer than your front door is tall, wrapped from end to end in overlapping plates like a suit stitched together, one careful section at a time. Dozens upon dozens of legs carry it forward in that same steady wave, which, if you think about it for even a second, is a truly impressive number of shoes to keep track of every single morning. If you're picturing something with fangs and a temper, you can relax. This particular giant has somewhere else to be and something much quieter on its mind. Dinner mostly. It crosses a shallow black pool of still water, and for a moment its own reflection moves beside it, plate for plate, leg for leg, like a second giant walking just beneath the surface. Somewhere out past the tree line, something calls softly into the dark, a low, wet, croaking sound older than frogs, older than almost everything you know how to name. Then quiet again. Just the soft patter of the first few raindrops finding their way down through hundreds of feet of leaves, above tapping gently against everything they touch. The rain settles into a slow, steady rhythm, the kind that seems built for exactly this moment. Nothing sudden, nothing sharp, just a soft, endless drizzle, sliding off giant fronds and pooling quietly in the moss below. Every few seconds, a single fat drop lands somewhere along the giant's back, rolls off one smooth armoured plate, and disappears into the dark. It does not flinch. It does not even slow down. This is simply what a normal evening feels like out here, in a world with no roofs and no umbrellas, only patience. It moves toward a pile of soft rotting leaves near the base of an ancient tree, and there it begins to feed, slowly, patiently, the way something only does when it has absolutely nowhere else to be. For a creature this size, there is no need to rush. There is no need to sneak. Nothing in this forest is fast enough or foolish enough to challenge something wearing quite that much armour. And in its own quiet way, this giant is doing something important. Every leaf it eats, every scrap of soft rotting wood it clears from the forest floor, gets broken down a little faster, return to the soil a little sooner so that somewhere above a new fern can unfurl and reach toward the light. Nothing this creature is doing tonight looks brave or dramatic or worth writing home about, and yet as far as anyone has been able to piece together without giants like this one quietly cleaning up, after an entire forest night after night, the world above could not keep growing the way it does. If you've ever kept a small compost bin tucked behind your house, turning old vegetable scraps into rich dark soil for your garden, you already understand this creature better than you might think. It is doing the very same job. It is just doing it on a much, much larger scale, and without ever once checking a single instruction label. Somewhere nearby, something small and pale skitters across a fallen branch, a distant six-legged cousin of the cockroach you might chase out of a kitchen one day. Except here it moves without a single worry, because for once it is not the biggest thing in the room. Tonight's size is measured differently. A creature that might make you jump in your own backyard is simply background noise here, completely unbothered going about its evening, like nothing in the world could possibly threaten it. In this forest at this moment, the small things finally get to relax. Take a slow breath with me here if you can. There is something oddly peaceful about a place this old, this quiet, where the biggest thing around is only interested in dinner and a soft place to rest. No traffic, no notifications, just rain and leaves, and one very large, very patient neighbour going about its evening exactly the way it has for longer than most of us can truly picture. And if your eyes are already starting to feel heavy right about now, good. That is exactly what tonight is for. Little by little the giant finishes its meal and begins to move again, unhurried back toward the fallen log where we first found it, leaving nothing behind but a faint trail pressed into the soft earth. A trail that one distant day, long after every tree in this forest has turned to stone and coal and memory, someone will find preserved in rock and wonder who or what could possibly have left it. If only they knew we were here to see it happen firsthand. For a very long time, the people who study this ancient world believed they understood exactly who this quiet giant was. A gentle wanderer, slow-moving, harmless, simply passing through. And in many ways that much still seems to hold up. But the harder scientists have looked layer by layer, piece by piece, the more this creature has surprised them, revealing details about its body, its face, and its place in the story of life on Earth that nobody expected to find. We will get to that part, I promise. It is still waiting for us later tonight. But before we can understand how a creature like this ever came to rule an entire forest without a single rival stepping up to challenge it, we need to step back even further than tonight. Back before there were footprints like this one left behind at all. Back to a time when nothing with a backbone had ever managed to crawl out of the water and survive on solid ground. A world that belonged completely and quietly to creatures just like the one we watched walk into the dark a moment ago. Stay with me a little longer. The lights are already low, the rain is already falling, and there is a great deal more of this ancient world still waiting for us to find it. So let's do exactly that. Let's walk backward together past this rainy swamp, past the giant slowly folding itself back into the shadow of that fallen log, back through millions upon millions of quiet, uncounted years, until the forest around us starts to feel different. Thinner, younger stranger still figuring itself out. Here is a question worth sitting with for a moment, and I mean that honestly, not as some rhetorical trick to keep you watching. When you picture the very first living thing to ever crawl out of the water and survive even for a single afternoon on dry land, what do you imagine? Something with 4 legs, maybe. A fish with a stubborn streak dragging itself across the mud toward some blurry distant future. That is certainly the version most of us grew up with. It is the version that ends up in museum displays and documentary narration mostly because it eventually leads to us. But it is not actually where this story begins, and if you ask me, that is the part almost nobody bothers to mention, long before anything with a backbone ever attempted that first clumsy crawl out of a river. Tiny distant cousins of the very giant we just left behind in the rain had already done it. Quietly. Without a single camera rolling, without any fanfare at all. Fossilized traces of small air-breathing, many-legged creatures, ancestors of millipedes barely longer than your thumbnail, have been pulled out of rock, laid down well over 400 million years ago, tens of millions of years before anything resembling a proper backbone ever risked the same journey. While the ancestors of fish were still entirely committed to staying wet, these small armoured pioneers were already testing what it felt like to breathe open air, to walk on solid ground, to exist somewhere no living thing had ever dared to exist before. Think about that for a second. Before there were forests to climb, before there was a single blade of anything green taller than your ankle, these small arthropods were already out there alone working out the rules of an entirely new kind of life. Nobody applauded. Nobody wrote it down at the time, obviously, since writing itself was still an unthinkable number of years away. But it happened, and in a very real sense, everything we watched unfold in that rainy swamp a little while ago, the giant, the fallen log, the whole quiet, thriving forest, all of it traces back to that first small unnoticed act of nerve, if we can even call it that. Maybe it was simply hunger driving something forward. Either way, land belonged to them first. Try to picture just for a moment what that very first fish with sturdy fins must have looked like, hauling itself up onto a muddy riverbank for the first time in the whole history of the planet. No instinct to guide it properly, no ancestor to copy only raw trial and error gills straining against air instead of water, its own weight suddenly feeling unfamiliar and heavy without the water to hold it up. It probably lasted only a few minutes before sliding back into the shallows, exhausted, having accomplished as far as it could possibly know absolutely nothing at all. And yet generation after generation that same clumsy, exhausting attempt kept happening again and again until eventually painfully slowly it started to work. Here is the part that tends to surprise people the most, so let me say it plainly. For an enormous stretch of time after that, land truly belonged to creatures without a spine, almost entirely uncontested, while the ancestors of the giant we met earlier were spreading out, sorting themselves into countless different shapes and sizes, testing which strategies worked and which ones quietly failed. Vertebrate life was still stuck figuring out the absolute basics. The very first fish, with sturdy limb-like fins strong enough to prop themselves up in shallow water, did not appear until many tens of millions of years after those small arthropod pioneers had already settled in. And even then, calling those early attempts successful land dwellers would be more than a little generous. Picture something built almost entirely for water, with a thick, heavy body and stubby limbs never quite designed for the job, now being asked of them, hauling itself a few awkward feet up a muddy bank gasping, before sliding right back into the safety of the shallows. That was not a triumphant conquest of land. That was closer to a long, uncomfortable improvisation, and even once those first true four-legged animals had properly emerged, they were nothing like the confident lizards and salamanders you might picture wandering through your own backyard today. Most were built low and heavy with wide splayed limbs, better suited for shoving through mud than for any real walking, and many never strayed more than a short, cautious hop away from open water. Some grew to a fair size longer than a full-grown alligator in a few cases, but size alone does not equal confidence. These were creatures still tethered to the margins, patrolling the edges of rivers and swamps, snapping up whatever small soft-bodied prey happened to wander near enough, never once venturing into the deep, dry interior of the forest where our armored giant made its home. Two very different kingdoms sharing the very same patch of earth and barely ever crossing paths. And it stayed that way for a surprisingly long while, mostly because of one enormous problem standing between those early wanderers and any real independence from the water: their eggs. Soft, unprotected, and utterly dependent on staying wet, which meant every single generation still had to return to a pond, a stream, or a marsh to reproduce at all. Picture an entire branch of life permanently tied to the water's edge by an invisible leash, unable to wander far, unable to properly explore the vast, dry world stretching out beyond the swamp. Meanwhile, our armored giant and its countless smaller relatives had no such leash whatsoever. They could roam as far from water as curiosity or hunger happened to carry them. It would take a very long while, yet deep into the same era we visited a little earlier, before a truly independent land vertebrate finally showed up. And when it did, it was almost laughably small compared to the giant we just watched cross that shallow black pool, along a stretch of towering fossilized tree stumps on the coast of what is now Nova Scotia, in what people today call the Joggins Cliffs. Paleontologists eventually uncovered something remarkable. Ancient hollow tree trunks, long since rotted out from the inside, apparently served as natural pitfall traps for small creatures wandering the forest floor. Somewhere in the middle of one of these fossilized stumps lay the skeleton of a slender little animal, barely the length of your forearm, that turned out to be the oldest confirmed reptile ever found. Not an amphibian tied forever to the water's edge. An actual reptile with the kind of egg that could be laid safely on dry land and still survive. In other words, the very first vertebrate on the entire planet capable of walking away from water for good and simply never looking back. I want you to sit with that image for a moment, because it is a truly strange one once you let it settle in. That little creature, small enough to fit comfortably in two cupped hands, represents the true beginning of everything that would eventually grow into lizards, into birds, into every mammal you have ever met, including yourself. And it shows up on the scene only after our armored giant had already been quietly ruling the undergrowth for tens of millions of years. If you had somehow stood in that forest and watched both creatures walk past you on the very same afternoon, there would have been no contest whatsoever about who the forest truly belonged to. One was an experiment still finding its feet. The other had already mastered the ground beneath it generations before that experiment had even begun. I will be honest with you, since I think the honest version of this story is always the better one. A handful of researchers studying old riverbed rock in Poland have pointed to faint trackways, footprints pressed into stone that may push the very first tentative steps onto land back even earlier than the skeletons we usually rely on by a good margin. Fossils are like that. They rarely hand over a clean, tidy answer. More often they hand you a puzzle with several pieces still missing, and the honest thing to do is admit exactly that, rather than pretend the picture is more finished than it actually is. But no matter how you slice it, whichever exact date turns out to be the right one, every single version of this story agrees on the same basic shape. Arthropods got there first, and by a wide, comfortable margin. There is something almost humbling about that order of events, at least to me. We tend to tell the story of life on land as though it were always building steadily toward creatures like us, as if every early chapter existed mainly to set the stage for a spine, a skull, eventually a mind capable of wondering about its own beginnings. But the actual fossil record does not seem terribly interested in flattering us that way. For most of this particular chapter, we were not even a footnote. We were not there at all. The main characters for a very long stretch of Earth's story wore armor instead of skin, and got along just fine without a single bone among them. There is another detail worth pausing on here, one that rarely makes it into the highlight reel. Not only did our giant have no real rival competing for the same territory, it had for a very long while nothing whatsoever hunting it either. Those small water-bound amphibians patrolling the swamp edges were nowhere near large enough or bold enough to take on something wrapped in that much armour. There was no wolf waiting in the tree line, no great cat crouched low in the ferns, for an animal that size an entire lifetime could pass without a single serious threat ever crossing its path. Try to imagine what that must have felt like if a creature like that could feel anything near what we would call safe. Nowhere to hide from because nothing was hunting. Now it is worth asking why this particular stretch of forest even existed in the first place, since the coalfields we mentioned earlier tuck today beneath the ground in Pennsylvania and across the English countryside do not exactly sit in a swampy tropical climate anymore. And the answer has everything to do with where the continents themselves happened to be sitting at the time. The land masses we now call North America and Europe were back then fused together into one enormous stretch of Earth, and that entire stretch sat almost exactly along the planet's equator, drifting there slowly over unimaginable stretches of time, the way continents always do, at a pace far too slow for any single lifetime to notice. Warm, wet, and practically unmoving beneath the sun, that equatorial position is precisely why rain fell here, nearly without pause, why the forest never truly dried out, and why hundreds of millions of years later, people digging into cold, damp English soil would eventually pull ancient tropical coal straight out of the ground with no palm tree or humid breeze anywhere in sight to explain how it got there. So if you ever find yourself standing somewhere far from the equator today, and someone mentions that coal was once found beneath your feet, you now know the quiet, almost dizzying explanation behind it. The ground did not always sit where it sits now. An entire chunk of the world quietly drifted, carrying its ancient rain-soaked forests along with it, until piece by piece it settled into whatever shape happens to appear on a map today. None of this is meant to diminish vertebrates, by the way, in case that is how it is starting to sound. We got here eventually, and clearly we did quite a lot with the opportunity once it finally arrived. But there is real value, I think, in resisting the urge to see every chapter of this planet's history as simply a warm-up act for us. For a stretch of time longer than most of us can comfortably hold in our heads, this forest and countless forests just like it scattered across that same warm equatorial belt belonged fully and completely to creatures with no bones at all. Not through some dramatic conquest, not through any battle fought and won, simply because they arrived first, adapted fastest, and quietly filled every available space long before anything else showed up to argue the point. Have you ever noticed how most nature documentaries seem to treat every era before the dinosaurs as little more than a footnote, a brief forgettable warm-up before the real story begins? I've always found that a little unfair. Whole kingdoms rose and fell here with their own giants, their own quiet dramas long before anything with scales and enormous teeth ever got its turn in front of a camera. It is a strange kind of bias when you notice it. We hand out the starring role almost automatically to whichever creature ends up being the biggest, the toothiest, the most easily turned into a toy on a store shelf, and quietly skip past the small patient pioneers who did the actual hard work of getting life onto dry land in the first place. Which does leave one obvious question still sitting unanswered in the dark, waiting patiently for us to notice it. Empty land and an early head start explain how these creatures got there first, certainly, but they do not explain how something built the way our giant is built ever managed to grow so unbelievably large in the first place. Plenty of small arthropods spread across those same ancient forests and stayed exactly that small. Something else was working quietly in their favour, something you could not see, could not touch, and would never have noticed unless you happened to take in one slow, deep breath of that ancient forest air and compare it very carefully to the breath you just took right now. Go ahead and take that breath now slowly if you would like to. Hold it for just a second longer than usual. Whatever you are feeling in your chest right now, that same ordinary breath, taken in that ancient forest instead of wherever you happen to be lying tonight, would have felt entirely different, richer somehow, almost strange. And that difference, small as it might sound, turns out to be one of the biggest secrets this whole story has been quietly holding on to. Hold on to that feeling for just another moment, because there is a very good reason that breath would have felt different, and it has nothing to do with imagination. Here is something almost nobody thinks about when picturing an ancient forest, until someone actually points it out. The air filling your lungs back there would have been doing something you've never once experienced in your entire life, no matter where you have travelled, no matter how deeply you've ever breathed. The air on this planet today is roughly 21% oxygen. That number has stayed fairly steady for a long while now, steady enough that most of us never think about it at all, the way you never think about the floor holding you up until it suddenly stops doing so. Every breath you have ever taken, every single one without exception, drew on that same familiar percentage, whether you were sitting quietly in a kitchen somewhere or gasping partway up a steep hillside. It is simply the background rule of being alive so constant that questioning it barely occurs to anyone. But rewind the clock back to the height of that ancient rain-soaked forest, and the number climbs dramatically up towards somewhere near 35%. That does not sound like a large jump written out as two ordinary numbers on a page. In practice, it meant every single breath pulled into every living thing on the surface of this planet was carrying substantially more raw fuel than any breath you or I have ever taken, generation after generation, for tens of millions of years running. Have you ever wondered what it might actually feel like to breathe air that rich, even for a single afternoon? Not gasping for it the way you might at altitude, but the exact opposite air, practically offering itself up to your lungs before you had even finished asking. Hold that thought. We are going to come back to it before tonight is through. Here is a question worth pausing on for a second. How would anyone possibly know that all these hundreds of millions of years later, nobody was standing there with an instrument after all, and no ancient weather station survived to hand down a tidy record? The answer turns out to be almost poetic once you hear it. Buried deep inside old coal seams alongside the plant matter that eventually became the coal itself, geologists keep finding tiny delicate fragments of ancient charcoal, the leftover ash of long extinguished forest fires. And it turns out that how easily a fire catches and how completely it burns depends heavily on how much oxygen happens to be swirling through the air at the time. Rich oxygen-heavy air lets fire rip through even damp, waterlogged vegetation with startling ease, the kind of soggy undergrowth that would simply refuse to burn in the air surrounding you right now. By carefully counting and studying these thin, fragile scraps of prehistoric ash, layer after layer, seam after seam, sometimes sifted out of rock samples no larger than a coin, researchers have been able to reconstruct something very near a chemical fingerprint of that ancient sky. A humble little clue tucked inside soot, nobody would think twice about quietly telling an entire story about the air itself, one blackened fragment at a time. Now, why would any of this matter to a creature built the way our giant is built? This is where the story gets properly interesting, so stay with me. You and I breathe using lungs, and from there our blood does the heavy lifting, carrying oxygen through a network of vessels to every muscle, every organ, every distant corner of the body that needs it. It is an efficient system, but it took evolution an enormous amount of tinkering to arrive at. Arthropods creatures like our armored giant never bothered evolving anything of the sort. Instead, their bodies are threaded through almost like a sponge with an enormous network of tiny branching tubes carrying air directly from small openings along the body wall straight to the tissues that need it. No lungs, no blood involved in the process at all. Just air quietly diffusing inward tube by tube until it reaches exactly where it is needed. It is a wonderfully simple system, and for a small creature it works beautifully. The trouble shows up the moment that creature starts getting larger. Diffusion. The simple, passive drifting of oxygen molecules from a busy area to an empty one only works efficiently across short distances. Picture a drop of ink released into a perfectly still glass of water. Given enough time, it spreads and colours the whole glass evenly. Give that same drop a swimming pool to work with instead, and it barely makes it past the spot where it landed, no matter how patiently you wait for it to spread any farther. Oxygen moving through those tiny tubes behaves in almost exactly that way. Push a body past a certain size and the oxygen entering along its surface simply stops reaching the deep interior tissues in time to keep them properly fed. Somewhere near the very center of a body built too large for its own breathing system, cells would begin quietly starving, long before any outward sign of trouble ever showed. This is precisely why in the world surrounding you and me today nothing built quite like an insect or a myriapod ever gets particularly large. The very system keeping them alive quietly puts a ceiling on how big they are allowed to become, an invisible glass lid pressing down on every generation, whether they ever notice it or not. Except, of course, that ceiling depends entirely on how much oxygen happens to be available in the first place. Raise the concentration in the surrounding air, and that same passive sponge-like system can suddenly push oxygen a good deal farther before it runs out of momentum. More available oxygen effectively raises the ceiling itself, allowing a body built this way to grow considerably larger before its own interior tissues start quietly starving. In a world sitting at 35% oxygen, instead of 21, an armored giant with a body several feet long was not defying the rules of its own biology at all. It was simply the rules of that particular era worked out to their fullest, most generous conclusion. If it helps to picture it a little differently, imagine trying to empty a packed stadium through a single narrow doorway. With one small exit, the crowd backs up almost immediately, and anyone standing near the far side of the stadium waits an uncomfortably long while before ever reaching fresh air outside. Now imagine that same stadium suddenly grows 3 or 4 extra doorways along its walls, each one wide open. Suddenly everyone gets out in a fraction of the time, including the people sitting farthest from any single exit. Oxygen moving through a body works on a strikingly similar principle. More available supply pushing in from every direction effectively behaves like extra doorways, letting that same passive drifting motion reach corners of the body it could never have reached before. This is not only a tidy theory dreamed up after the fact, either which I think is the part that makes it properly convincing. Researchers studying insect biology have actually managed to test it directly, raising dragonflies and beetles inside sealed chambers pumped full of oxygen-enriched air generation after generation. And sure enough, those insects grew noticeably larger than their relatives breathing ordinary air outside the chamber, exactly the way the underlying physics would predict. It is not every day that a hypothesis about events hundreds of millions of years old can be tested directly in a laboratory within a single afternoon. This one can, and it holds up. There is a second entirely separate thread of evidence too, one that comes straight out of the rock itself rather than any laboratory. Fossil hunters combing through insect remains from different chapters of Earth's history have noticed something striking a pattern that lines up almost perfectly with the rise and fall of atmospheric oxygen over deep time. When oxygen levels were riding high, insect fossils from that same window tend to run noticeably larger. As oxygen slowly eased back down in later chapters of Earth's story, average body size among those same insect groups eased downward right alongside it, almost like a shadow following the sun across a wall. Two completely different methods, one built from careful laboratory experiments, the other pulled from patiently sorted fossil drawers, and both keep arriving at the very same conclusion. Remember that heavy low-flying shape that passed over our giant earlier in the rain wing, stretching wider than a dinner plate? That was no accident of nature showing off. That was a direct living consequence of the very air it was moving through. A body plan only possible because the atmosphere around it happened to be generous enough to support it. Take a moment now to picture its nearest living relative, resting on a reed somewhere beside a quiet pond, this very evening, wings barely spanning the width of your outstretched hand. Same basic body plan, same ancient family lines separated by nothing more dramatic than a few percentage points of oxygen and a few 100 million years of patient ordinary change. I do want to be fair to the science here though, since I think an honest storyteller owes you that much. Oxygen alone does not appear to explain the whole picture, and researchers studying this question openly admit as much. An empty, uncontested world with no large predators worth worrying about. The very kind of world we spent time exploring a little earlier almost certainly played its own part as well, giving evolution room to experiment with size without immediately being punished for it. Rich, damp forests offering an abundance of food probably mattered too. There is one more piece worth mentioning, a quieter, more uncomfortable one. Every one of those overlapping armoured plates we admired earlier is in its own way a prison as much as a suit of protection. It cannot stretch. It cannot expand gradually the way skin does. So every time a creature built this way needs to grow even slightly larger, it has to shed the entire outer shell, completely splitting it down the back and stepping out, soft, pale, and almost defenseless, until the next layer of armor has time to harden properly around it. For a small creature, that vulnerable window lasts only a few careful hours. For something built on the scale of our giant, that same soft exposed period would have stretched on considerably longer, a long tense evening spent trusting the world outside its own broken shell. In a forest crawling with hungry predators, that kind of vulnerability would have been a death sentence repeated over and over every single time the creature needed to grow. In a forest with nothing much interested in taking advantage of it, that same vulnerable window barely mattered at all. Oxygen built the ceiling, but it took this kind of quiet, ordinary good fortune generation after generation to safely fill the space beneath that ceiling with something quite this large. Here is a small thought experiment for you, and it might be worth trying properly if you're still awake enough to give it a moment of real attention. Think back to the last time you found yourself somewhere at high altitude, a mountain town maybe, or a hiking trail cresting some unfamiliar ridge, and noticed how much harder ordinary breathing suddenly felt. That thin, oxygen-starved air makes even climbing a short flight of stairs feel like real effort, the kind that leaves you a little embarrassed in front of anyone who happens to reside there full time and thinks nothing of it. Now flip that entire sensation completely around. Imagine air so rich, so heavily loaded with oxygen, that your own lungs barely had to work at all to keep you feeling fully alive, every breath practically doing your body a favour without being asked. That was simply an ordinary evening in this particular forest. Nothing special about it as far as anything living there was concerned. Just Tuesday, so to speak, if Tuesdays had existed yet for anyone to notice. There is something quietly humbling about all of this, at least to me. We tend to imagine size as a kind of achievement, something a creature earns through sheer strength or aggression or evolutionary cunning. And here in this particular corner of Earth's story, the truth turns out to be far gentler than that. This creature did not fight its way to becoming enormous. It simply happened to exist at the right moment, breathing the right air in a forest, with nobody around interested in punishing it for growing exactly as large as its own biology would allow. Sometimes the difference between staying small and becoming a giant has less to do with courage, and rather more to do with simply being handed the right conditions at the right time and having the patience to grow into them. It is worth remembering, too, that this is not some strange isolated case unique to one armoured creature in one ancient swamp. Even today, the tallest trees on Earth, the towering sequoias standing along parts of the western coastline of the United States, run into a strikingly similar wall. Water has to travel from root to crown, against the pull of gravity the entire way, and past a certain height, roughly comparable generation after generation. Physics simply refuses to let it climb any farther, no matter how much sunlight or soil or patient growing time a tree happens to be given. Different creature, different chapter of Earth's story, entirely different set of physical rules, and yet the underlying lesson keeps repeating itself. Life does not grow exactly as large as ambition might prefer. It grows exactly as large as the surrounding world quietly allows, and not 1 inch further. But knowing why something could grow this large is a very different question from knowing how anyone ever managed to prove that a creature like this existed in the first place. Because for a remarkably long stretch of modern history, the very idea of an armoured giant walking through ancient rainforests sat buried quite literally without a single living soul aware it had ever happened at all. No sketch in an old naturalist notebook, no mention in any legend passed down around a fire, just silence pressed flat under layer after layer of rock waiting. That particular story, the story of how this giant was finally dragged piece by broken piece back out of the rock and into the light, turns out to be nearly as strange as the creature itself, full of false starts, mistaken guesses, and one particularly stubborn mystery that would take considerably longer to solve than anyone involved ever expected. Every mystery this stubborn tends to start with somebody being completely wrong about what they are looking at, and this one is no exception. Workers cutting through rock for a new railway line in Germany, sometime in the late 1840s, struck something strange buried in the stone. Long ridge segmented shapes pressed flat into the rock like some enormous ancient ribbon, dark against the pale surrounding stone. Nobody working that railway cut had ever seen anything remotely like it. And understandably enough, their first guess reached for the closest thing their imagination could offer. A worm. An impossibly large ancient worm curled and fossilized inside solid rock, dragged up into daylight by men who almost certainly had no idea they were holding a piece of the largest arthropod ever to walk the earth. Try to imagine standing there yourself, pickaxe still in hand, staring down at something that plainly does not belong in the ordinary run of railway construction. What would you have guessed, given nothing to compare it to? No textbook, no museum display, no century of accumulated scientific knowledge to lean on? A worm is not a bad guess at all, honestly. It is simply the wrong one, and it would take a little longer and a considerably more careful set of eyes to work out exactly how wrong. It would take a few more years and 2 patient naturalists willing to look considerably closer before anyone realized just how wrong that first guess truly was. In 1854, Hermann Jordan and Hermann von Meyer published a careful description of these strange remains, and in doing so gave the creature its proper name for the very first time. Not a worm at all. Something jointed, armoured, unmistakably related to the small many-legged creatures already crawling around gardens and forest floors across Europe, except stretched out to a size nobody had previously imagined possible. They called it Arthropleura, borrowing from old Greek roots meaning something along the lines of jointed rib, a fitting enough description for a creature built almost entirely out of overlapping rib-like plates strung together down its entire length. With that single, unassuming publication, an entirely new chapter of prehistoric life quietly opened. Even if almost nobody outside a small circle of naturalists noticed it happening at the time, here is the part that tends to surprise people once they hear it, though. Naming a creature is one thing. Actually understanding it is an entirely different and considerably harder undertaking, and this particular giant would spend the next century and a half testing the patience of everyone who tried. For decades after that first description, all anyone had to work with was scraps. A single armoured plate found in one coal bed. A handful more turning up decades later and hundreds of miles away in rock, pulled from mines scattered across what is now Ohio and Pennsylvania. Isolated fragments kept surfacing in northern France in Czech quarries, even much later on the Italian island of Sardinia, each one a lonely puzzle piece with no obvious way of confirming how, or even whether it connected to any of the others. By the 1880s, an American researcher named Samuel Scudder had gathered enough of these scattered fragments to properly organize them, establishing an entire family of related creatures, and confirming beyond much doubt that this giant belonged among the ancient relatives of millipedes. It is worth remembering that the whole discipline of classifying extinct arthropods was still remarkably young at the time, built on little more than careful comparison and patient guesswork, decades before anyone had the tools to look inside a fossil rather than simply measuring its outside. Getting the classification right using nothing but a handful of disconnected plates and a trained eye was no small accomplishment. But organizing fragments is not the same as understanding a whole living creature. Imagine being handed a single page torn from a much longer book, then a second page decades later, found in a completely different library on a different continent, written in a hand that only barely resembles the first. Then a third page turns up in someone's private collection, unlabeled decades after that. You're asked the entire time to reconstruct the whole story from nothing but those disconnected scraps with no guarantee any two of them even belong to the same edition. That was essentially the position paleontologists found themselves in generation after generation, patiently gathering pieces of a puzzle that refused to reveal its full picture. Have you ever tried piecing together a jigsaw puzzle missing most of its pieces with no box lid to show you what the finished picture is even supposed to look like? That is not a bad way to imagine what studying this creature felt like for the better part of 100 years. Everyone involved was reasonably confident about the shape of the story, but nobody could yet see the whole of it clearly. What made the puzzle especially frustrating was not simply a shortage of fossils, but the particular way this creature tended to leave evidence behind in the first place. Like the small arthropods we spent time with earlier, growing meant molting, shedding an entire suit of hardened armor and stepping out from underneath it. Most of what scientists eventually found were not bodies at all, but abandoned shells left behind in a riverbed or a patch of soft mud the moment their owner outgrew them and quietly wandered off to grow a new one elsewhere. A creature could be spotted in a sense without a single trace of its own actual body ever being recovered. Then, in January of 2018, on a cold fading afternoon, along a stretch of coastline in Northumberland in the north of England, something changed. Everything researchers thought they understood about how large this animal could actually get. A small group of geologists, former university students on nothing more than a casual weekend trip, were walking along the beach as the light was starting to disappear. It was not a research expedition. There was no funding attached to the outing, no equipment list, no formal plan beyond enjoying a familiar stretch of coastline, that one member of the group happened to know well from earlier holidays. One of them noticed something odd. Resting near the base of the cliffs, a large boulder that had clearly broken free and tumbled down at some point, splitting cleanly open, when it landed almost as if it had been waiting patiently for exactly the right person to walk past. Tucked inside that accidental crack, perfectly exposed as though someone had planned it that way, sat an enormous fossilized shape, dark ridges of armor plating running the entire visible length of the stone. For a moment, standing there in the fading light, nobody quite knew what to say. This particular stretch of coastline, made up mostly of sandstone, was not exactly known among paleontologists as promising fossil territory. Sandstone tends to be unkind to delicate remains, crumbling and shifting in ways that rarely leave anything worth studying behind. And yet here it was anyway, defying every reasonable expectation anyone in that small group might have carried onto the beach with them that afternoon. One imagines a fairly long pause, followed by someone quietly asking whether anybody else was seeing the same thing they were. I want you to sit with that image for a moment, because there is something wonderfully human about it. No grant proposal led to this discovery, no carefully planned excavation, no months of careful surveying beforehand. Just a group of tired researchers on an ordinary walk, glancing sideways at exactly the right moment toward exactly the right broken rock, on a beach that nobody had ever considered a particularly promising place to search for fossils in the first place. The senior researcher on the project would later describe the entire find as a complete stroke of luck, and it is hard to disagree with him. Some of the most important discoveries in the entire history of paleontology, it turns out, owe less to careful planning than to somebody simply happening to look in the right direction at the right moment on an otherwise unremarkable afternoon. Getting the fossils safely off that beach turned out to be its own small adventure. The specimen was large enough and heavy enough that it eventually took 4 grown adults working together just to carry it back up the cliff face to solid ground months after the initial discovery, once proper permission had been secured from the landowners and the relevant conservation authorities. Once it finally reached Cambridge for careful study, the numbers involved left even seasoned researchers a little stunned. Only 2 other fossils of remotely comparable quality had ever been found anywhere on the planet, before this one both considerably smaller, both recovered decades earlier from German coal deposits, not far from where this whole story first began back in the 1840s. This new specimen from a quiet English beach was not simply a nice addition to the collection. It was instantly the oldest, the largest, and by a considerable margin the most complete body fossil of its kind that anyone had ever laid eyes on. It also quietly toppled a record that had stood for a very long while. Before this discovery, the title of largest arthropod in Earth's history technically belonged to an entirely different creature, an ancient sea scorpion that prowled shallow coastal waters around roughly the same span of time. Our armored giant did not just join that record book, it rewrote the very top line of it, and moved the story of the largest creature of its kind firmly out of the water and onto dry land, exactly where this whole story has belonged from the very beginning. These days, if you ever find yourself near Cambridge, you can walk right up and see a portion of that very fossil resting behind glass in a university museum near enough to touch if the staff would ever let you. Based on the proportions of the preserved section, the complete animal would have stretched nearly 9 feet from end to end, and likely weighed somewhere in the neighbourhood of 110 pounds. For context, that is heavier than a fully grown male German shepherd. This was not simply the largest Arthropleura fossil ever recovered. It was and remains the single largest arthropod of any kind ever confirmed to have existed on this planet in the entire long history of segmented armoured life. Here is where the story gets a little more interesting, and a lot more honest than a simple record-breaking headline might suggest. This particular fossil turned out to be older than researchers initially expected, dating from a stretch of time before atmospheric oxygen had actually reached its highest recorded levels. Have you noticed, by the way, how tidy explanations have a way of getting delightfully messy? The moment new evidence shows up, science rarely minds that. If anything, it tends to welcome it. In other words, this exact giant, one of the largest ever confirmed, appears to have reached its enormous size slightly ahead of the very oxygen peak we spent so long discussing a little earlier. It does not undo that earlier explanation so much as complicate it in exactly the way real science tends to get complicated. Rich oxygen-heavy air clearly helped later on once atmospheric conditions caught up with what this particular lineage was already capable of. But this particular fossil is a useful reminder that no single tidy explanation ever fully captures a story this old. A nutrient-dense diet, an unusually stable environment, and a complete absence of anything willing to challenge a creature this size may have mattered just as much as the air filling its lungs, if not slightly more at least for this earlier population, living before the atmosphere had finished catching up with them. And yet, for all that this remarkable discovery revealed one piece of the puzzle, remained just as stubbornly absent as it had been since that very first misidentified worm back in the 1840s. No head. Once again, researchers had recovered a magnificent record-breaking body, and once again the one part of the creature capable of finally answering the oldest lingering question about it, what exactly this animal was built to eat, and how it actually experienced the world around it simply was not there. By this point, you could almost forgive scientists for beginning to wonder whether that particular piece of anatomy was destined to stay hidden forever. Fragment after fragment, decade after decade, one dramatic discovery after another, and still the face of one of the largest creatures ever to walk on land remained quite literally unknown to modern science. A century and a half of patient, careful, sometimes wonderfully lucky detective work, and the single most basic question anyone could possibly ask about this creature was still sitting there unanswered, buried somewhere in rock nobody had happened to crack open just yet. There is something almost poetic about a mystery lasting that long, at least to me. We tend to assume that science moves in a straight, tidy line, one confident discovery quietly leading to the next. But the real story is rarely that polite. Sometimes an answer waits 170 years for the right rock to finally split open in exactly the right place. And in the meantime, patient researchers keep doing what they have always done, piecing together everything they possibly can from what little the Earth is willing to hand over. Which is, as it turns out, still a remarkable amount once you know how to properly interpret it, because even without a single glimpse of its face, all of those scattered plates, all of those molted shells, all of those trackways pressed into ancient mud, had already told researchers a surprising amount about the rest of this creature. How it was built, how it carried that enormous weight across soft, uneven ground. How something without a single bone in its entire body still managed to become the largest land animal of its kind the planet has ever produced. That part of the story, unlike the face, was quietly coming into focus the entire time, one careful measurement at a time. So let's spend a little while with what that patient piece-by-piece detective work actually uncovered, because the body this giant carried around, faceless or not, turns out to be every bit as remarkable as the mystery still wrapped around its missing head. Strip away the mystery for a moment and look simply at what the rock itself was willing to show, because even without a face to study, researchers had by this point accumulated an unusually rich picture of everything else. Bodies do not survive whole very often in the fossil record, but pieces arranged carefully enough across enough different specimens start to add up to something almost as good as a complete skeleton laid out neatly on a table. Think of it a little like restoring an old family photograph that has been torn into dozens of separate pieces scattered across drawers and boxes in different houses, collected by different people who never met each other across more than a century. No single piece tells you very much on its own, but laid out together, carefully matched by edge and texture and pattern, an unmistakable picture eventually begins to take shape, whether or not every last piece has actually been found. Begin with the plates themselves, since that is where almost every single fossil hunter's search inevitably starts. Running down the length of this creature's back, one behind another, sat a long procession of armoured segments, each one shaped in a particular distinctive way that took researchers a while to properly describe. Picture a narrow raised ridge running straight down the centre of each plate, flanked on either side by a slightly lower curved wing, almost like a small three-panelled roof tile repeated dozens of times down the entire length of the body. Specialists eventually settled on calling this a trilobate shape, three-lobed, and once you've seen one of these plates first-hand in a photograph or resting in a museum drawer, it becomes almost impossible to mistake for anything else on Earth living or extinct. Here is a small honest confession worth making, since I promised you honesty earlier, and intend to keep that promise. For all the detail researchers have managed to piece together about the shape of this creature, one very ordinary question remains almost entirely unanswered. What colour was it? Fossilization is remarkably good at preserving shape texture, even the faint impression of tiny surface bumps and ridges. It is remarkably poor at preserving colour, which tends to fade away long before the surrounding rock has finished hardening around whatever it is protecting. Every illustration you have ever seen of this creature, every documentary reconstruction, every museum mural is in that one specific sense, an educated guess dressed up to look like certainty. It might have been the deep mottled brown of wet bark. It might have carried faint bands of darker colour running down each segment, the way many modern millipedes still do. Nobody currently alive actually knows, and I think there is something quietly delightful about a mystery that basic still sitting unsolved, tucked in right alongside all the grander, more dramatic ones. How many of these plates did a single animal actually carry, you might reasonably wonder? The honest answer is that it varied, and that variation itself turned out to be a properly interesting clue. Some recovered specimens show as few as 20 segments strung together. Others, clearly older, more mature individuals, show closer to 30. For a long while, nobody was entirely sure what to make of that difference, whether it simply reflected different species or something else entirely. Here is where a set of remarkably small, almost easy to overlook fossils ended up mattering more than their size might suggest. Tucked away in a museum collection in France near an old mining region called Mont-Sault-le-Mine, sitting for years without drawing much attention, were two tiny specimens, one barely an inch long, the other not much longer, discovered decades earlier in old mining deposits, and largely set aside as curiosities, the kind of modest fossil that tends to sit quietly in a drawer while researchers chase after larger, flashier finds. When researchers finally returned to study them properly, they turned out to be juveniles, infant versions of the very same giant we've been following all evening, and their segment counts told a small, quiet story of their own. Fewer segments in the smaller specimen, more in the slightly larger one. In other words, this creature was not born with its full body plan already in place. It grew into it one additional segment at a time, adding new plates gradually across its own lifetime, the same unhurried way many modern millipedes still do today, rather than arriving complete and fully formed the way some of their distant relatives, the centipedes, generally do. Does that change how you picture it at all? I will admit it changed things a little for me the first time I properly sat with it. It is easy to imagine an ancient giant simply appearing fully formed, dramatic and complete from the moment it hatched. The truth turns out to be far gentler and honestly a good deal more relatable. Even something built on this scale started out small, vulnerable and thoroughly unfinished, gradually assembling itself into the creature this whole story keeps circling back to. Somewhere out there in some quiet corner of that ancient forest, a version of our giant barely longer than your thumb was once doing exactly the same thing every hatchling on Earth eventually has to do, simply trying to survive long enough to grow into whatever it was meant to become. Now flip that armoured body over, at least in your imagination, and a different set of plates comes into view along the underside, considerably less glamorous than the dramatic ridged armour running down the back, but arguably more revealing. Scattered across these lower plates, researchers eventually notice small neat clusters of tiny pierced openings, almost like a scattering of pinpricks pressed carefully into the surface. It took some careful comparison with living relatives to work out what these little openings likely represented. In modern millipedes, similar clusters of small pores serve as breathing openings, tiny doorways connecting the outside air directly to that branching network of internal tubes we spent so long discussing earlier tonight. Finding matching openings on a fossil this old was a small, quiet piece of physical proof for an idea that had, until then, mostly lived in the realm of careful inference. The plates were not just holding this creature together. They were in their own understated way helping it breathe. I find something rather touching about that honestly small, unglamorous holes doing such essential quiet work for something this enormous. We tend to picture armour as being all about defence spikes and plates built purely to keep danger out. Here at least part of that same armour was doing something far more basic and far more constant, simply letting the creature keep living one steady breath at a time for every single hour of every single day it existed. Let's talk about how it actually moved underneath all of that. A body wrapped in that many rigid, overlapping plates might sound like it would move stiffly, almost mechanically, but the engineering involved was considerably cleverer than that. Each plate overlapped slightly with the one behind it, the same basic principle you would recognize instantly from an old suit of armor or the flexible, segmented tail of a lobster pulled fresh from a restaurant tank, or if you would rather stay on dry land for the comparison, the way an armadillo can curl itself into a tight protected ball without a single one of its own bony plates ever cracking. That overlap allowed the whole structure to bend and flex along its length, even while every individual plate stayed completely rigid, giving the animal a body that was at the same time both heavily armoured and surprisingly capable of curling, twisting and adjusting itself around whatever obstacle happened to be sitting in its path. There is a practical question worth pausing on here too, one that does not get asked nearly often enough. A body this heavy moving across ground as soft and waterlogged as that ancient forest floor should by all rights have sunk with every single step. Modern creatures that size generally rely on either broad splayed feet or a great deal of buoyancy to avoid exactly that problem. This creature, spreading its considerable weight across dozens of separate legs rather than 4 or 6, may have solved the same problem in a rather elegant way simply by never asking any single point of contact to bear very much weight at all. It is not a fully settled question, and I want to be honest about that rather than pretend otherwise, but it offers a reasonable, physically sensible explanation for how something this substantial managed to wander freely across ground that would have swallowed a heavier, less evenly distributed animal within a few short steps. Supporting all of that armour and all of that patient decades-long growth was an extraordinary number of legs, more than most animals you've ever personally encountered. Every single one of those trilobate segments carried its own paired set underneath, and multiplied out across 20 or 25 or 30 segments, the total count climbs into properly impressive territory, likely somewhere in the neighborhood of 60 legs or more working together on a single fully grown adult. Coordinating that many limbs at once sounds on paper like an absolute nightmare of biological engineering, and yet judging from the smooth, steady trackways this creature left scattered across ancient riverbeds from Scotland down to the American Midwest, it appears to have managed the task rather gracefully, each leg simply following the rhythm set by the ones just ahead of it. Wave after quiet wave, the same basic coordination trick countless smaller, many-legged creatures still rely on in your own garden this very evening. We will spend more time with those trackways themselves a little later tonight, because the story pressed into that ancient mud turns out to be worth an evening of its own. Here is a comparison worth sitting with for a moment. Recall that fossil fragment pulled from the beach in Northumberland, the one that first properly confirmed just how enormous this creature could grow. That single preserved section alone measured roughly 30 inches from end to end, and stretched nearly 1.5 feet across at its widest point, wide enough that setting a fully opened pizza box down beside it would barely cover the difference. And that was only a portion of the whole animal, not the complete creature. Multiply that width down the entire remaining length, and you arrive at a body substantial enough that brushing past it in a dark forest would have felt considerably nearer to passing a large dog than stumbling across an oversized insect. Carrying the weight of a fully grown adult human on that many legs at once, no matter how evenly you spread the load, is simply not something you or I could manage without a great deal of practice. It is worth pausing here to notice something a little unusual about how this particular creature has been classified over the years, because the story is not quite as settled as you might expect from something studied for a century and a half. For most of that time, researchers confidently placed this giant among the ancient relatives of millipedes, largely based on exactly the kind of body evidence we've been walking through, those paired legs that segmented armor, the whole general architecture matching the millipede body plan closely enough that the classification felt for generations like settled science. Textbooks were written around that assumption. Museum reconstructions were built around it, sculpted and painted with a millipede's gentle, unthreatening character in mind. An entire mental picture quietly agreed upon by nearly everyone studying this creature, formed around the idea that this was at its core simply an enormous ancient millipede, nothing more mysterious than that. It is a reasonable conclusion, to be fair to everyone who reached it. The body honestly does look the part, plate for plate, leg for leg. But reasonable conclusions in any field of science are still conclusions built on incomplete evidence, and incomplete evidence has a quiet habit of eventually catching up with the people who trusted it a little too comfortably. Have you ever noticed how the most confident scientific conclusions sometimes turn out to be confident, mainly because nobody has yet found the one piece of evidence capable of properly complicating them? That is worth remembering here, because everything I have just described to you, every plate, every leg, every quietly breathing pore along its underside, comes entirely from the body. Not one single detail comes from the head, for the simple reason that as we spent so long establishing a little earlier tonight, nobody had ever actually found one properly preserved enough to study, which leaves this particular chapter of the story sitting in a strange suspended kind of place. An entire body patiently reconstructed across 170 years of scattered fragments, remarkably detailed, remarkably well understood, right up until the point where that long procession of armoured segments simply ends and an empty, unanswered space begins. Everything we have discussed tonight about how this creature grew, how it breathed, how it moved its considerable bulk across the forest floor was built entirely without ever once being able to look it in the eye, because nobody in 170 years of searching had ever actually seen its eyes or its mouth, or a single one of the features that would have finally told researchers exactly how this animal experienced the world around it. That gap, more than any single fossil, is what kept pulling researchers back to this particular mystery generation after generation. You can reconstruct an enormous amount about a creature from its body alone, as we have just spent a good while proving. But there is a very particular kind of curiosity that only a face can properly satisfy, and for a remarkably long stretch of modern scientific history, this one simply refused to give it up. Every reconstruction, every museum model, every careful illustration built from everything we have just walked through tonight still had to stop at exactly the same point right at the base of the neck, and simply guess at what came next. Some guesses leaned gentle, some leaned considerably less so. Nobody could say for certain which direction was closer to the truth because nobody had the one piece of evidence that would have settled the argument outright. And then quite suddenly, after all those decades of settled assumption, it finally did. Here is how 170 years of silence finally broke, and it did not happen with a dramatic new excavation or a lucky boulder cracking open on some windswept beach. It happened quietly inside a laboratory, aimed at two small fossils that had already been sitting patiently in a museum collection for years, waiting for the right question to finally be asked of them. No cliffside drama this time, no chance encounter at dusk, just careful, patient people, a piece of equipment considerably more advanced than anything available to previous generations of researchers, and a small stone the size of a walnut holding onto a secret it had kept for 300 million years. Remember those two tiny juveniles we spent time with a little earlier tonight, barely longer than your thumb, tucked away for years in French collections, without drawing much attention? They came from a particular stretch of ancient rock known as Mont-Sault-les-Mines, a name that will likely mean very little to you right now, and everything by the time we are finished. What made these two small fossils so unusually valuable had nothing to do with their size. It had everything to do with how they were preserved. Most fossils form as flattened impressions, pressure squeezing every trace of three-dimensional structure down into something not unlike a photograph, pressed into stone flat useful, but permanently missing an entire dimension of information. These two, though, had been captured inside hard-rounded mineral nodules, a kind of natural stone capsule that formed around the body shortly after it settled into the mud, hardening quickly enough to lock the entire three-dimensional shape in place before it could collapse flat under the weight of everything settling on top of it. In effect, nature had built its own tiny time capsule around these two small creatures, preserving not just their outline but their actual internal architecture layer upon delicate layer exactly as it existed the day they died. For a very long while that hardly mattered because nobody possessed a way to look safely inside a sealed stone capsule without destroying whatever was hidden within it. Cutting one open risked shattering the very structure researchers were hoping to study. So the nodules mostly sat in careful storage, catalogued, occasionally examined from the outside but never truly opened up to reveal what they were actually protecting. What finally changed was not the fossil, it was the tool. A team of researchers working with equipment capable of a particular kind of high-resolution scanning, essentially a far more powerful cousin of the machines used in hospitals, to look inside a human body without a single incision, turned that same basic principle toward these two small stubborn stone capsules. You have likely experienced a milder medical version of exactly this technology yourself, at some point lying still on a narrow table, while a machine quietly built a picture of your own insides without ever needing to open you up to do it. Now, imagine that same idea scaled up dramatically in resolution, aimed instead at a fossil smaller than your fist patient enough to capture details finer than a single strand of hair, thousands of individual X-ray images taken from every conceivable angle, as the tiny fossil rotated slowly inside the scanner, were then digitally stitched together into a complete three-dimensional model, allowing scientists to explore the inside of that fossil slice by invisible slice on a computer screen without ever laying a single physical tool against the actual specimen. The rock stayed completely intact throughout the entire process. Nothing was cut. Nothing was broken open. The answer that had eluded researchers for 170 years turned out to be sitting there the entire time, perfectly preserved, simply waiting for technology, capable of asking politely rather than by force. Have you ever wondered what it must feel like sitting at a screen watching a structure nobody has seen intact in 300 million years slowly resolve itself out of raw data, one digital layer at a time? I imagine it is something not unlike holding your breath without quite realizing you were doing it. And they're finally sitting in careful reconstructed detail after 170 years of educated guessing was the head, not a crushed fragment. Not a partial impression open to a dozen competing interpretations. An actual three-dimensional reconstruction of the front end of this creature's mandibles, and all precisely the piece of the puzzle that had eluded absolutely everyone who came before, all the way back to those confused railway workers pulling strange ribbed stone out of German rock in the 1840s. Here is where the story takes a turn that even the researchers involved did not fully expect going in. For a century and a half, remember, this creature had been comfortably filed away among the ancient relatives of millipedes, based on everything the body alone had been willing to reveal. Paired legs on every segment. That distinctive three-lobed armour running down the back. All of it pointed in one direction confidently, consistently, for generation after generation of researchers. The head told a rather different story. Buried safely inside, protected rather than exposed the way some related creatures carry theirs, sat a set of enclosed mandibles along with two additional pairs of small limbs positioned just behind them. And this particular arrangement, this specific combination of features, did not match a millipede's head plan cleanly at all. Here is the distinction worth understanding briefly, because it matters for exactly why this discovery landed the way it did. Millipedes tend to carry a fused plate-like structure, covering their mouthparts built primarily for grinding through plant matter. Centipedes, on the other hand, carry a very different arrangement up front, including a pair of specialized claw-like limbs, adapted in most living species for injecting venom into prey. Two entirely different head plans shaped by two entirely different ways of making a living. And the head resting inside that scanner leaned in several important respects considerably nearer to the second arrangement than the first, the very branch of the family tree nobody expected an ancient plant-grinding giant to have any real connection to at all. The researchers did not stop at simply examining the shape of the head, either which I think speaks well of how carefully this particular mystery was finally handled. They combined what the scan revealed with an enormous amount of genetic information gathered from living millipedes and centipedes today, comparing hundreds of genes across dozens of modern species, then testing where this ancient giant would most sensibly fit into that larger family tree. Once both the physical evidence and the genetic evidence were considered together. It is one thing to notice that an old fossil resembles a modern relative. It is another thing entirely to mathematically test that resemblance against the accumulated genetic history of an entire group of living creatures and have the numbers agree with what your eyes were already telling you. Two completely independent lines of evidence, one carved in ancient stone, the other written in the living genetic code of creatures alive today, arriving at the very same conclusion from two entirely different directions. Sit with that for a moment, because I think it deserves more than a passing mention. An animal confidently classified as a giant ancient millipede for 170 straight years Turns out once you finally look it in the face to be carrying features borrowed from what everyone assumed was an entirely separate lineage. Not quite a millipede, not quite a centipede either. Something sitting patiently at the exact branching point where those two enormously successful, still thriving groups of creatures first split apart from one another, tens of millions of years before either lineage fully became what we would recognize today. Think about what that actually means for a moment beyond the simple relabeling. Every millipede curled up under a rock in your own garden, and every centipede that startles you scurrying across a bathroom floor at some point, are both in a very real sense distant cousins of the creature we've been following through the rain all evening, connected all the way back to a single ancestor that had not yet decided, evolutionarily speaking, which direction it was eventually going to go. Our giant was not a strange evolutionary dead end sitting off to one side of the family tree. It was standing remarkably near the trunk itself, at a point in the story shared by two entire branches of living creatures still crawling around the modern world today. Does that surprise you at all? It surprised the researchers who found it, and I think there is something wonderfully humbling in that. An entire scientific community, careful, well-trained, working from properly excellent evidence, still ended up only halfway right, simply because one crucial piece of the picture had never been available to check their assumptions against. This is not a story about anyone doing careless science. It is a story about how confident science can afford to be while still quietly, patiently waiting for the one detail capable of rewriting the whole conclusion. We tend to imagine family trees as tidy, orderly things, one branch cleanly splitting from another, with an obvious line drawn between them. Real evolution rarely respects that kind of tidiness. It is considerably messier, considerably more gradual, filled with in-between creatures that never quite finished becoming one thing or the other, because the very question of becoming one thing or the other only makes sense looking backward long after the fact. At the actual moment this creature was alive, it was not confused about what it was. It was simply completely itself, and it took modern science 170 years to catch up with a category flexible enough to properly describe it. There is another small detail worth mentioning here, since I think it is worth being honest, even about the parts of the story that remain frustratingly incomplete. The scan also revealed the mounting points for a pair of eyes, small stalked structures projecting from the head, roughly club-shaped in form. But the delicate surface tissue that would have actually done the seeing did not survive the intervening 300 million years, not even inside a protective stone capsule this effective. Based on comparisons with living relatives, researchers reasonably suspect these were compound eyes, built from many individual lenses working together the same basic design countless insects still rely on today. Reasonably suspect is not quite the same thing as confirmed though, and I think that honest gap deserves mentioning rather than smoothing over for the sake of a tidier story. Even the most remarkable discovery in 170 years still left one small, stubborn question sitting politely, patiently unanswered. I keep returning to how strange it must have felt being one of the researchers actually present for that reveal. Generations of scientists before you spent entire careers working from the neck down, building careful, reasonable, ultimately incomplete pictures of a creature none of them had ever properly seen in full. And then on some ordinary afternoon in a laboratory surrounded by humming equipment and glowing monitors, coffee going cold somewhere on a nearby desk, you become the very first person in the entire history of the modern world to look this particular giant in the face. Every scientist who ever wrote a paper about this creature, going all the way back to those two patient naturalists in the 1850s, would have given a great deal to be standing exactly where you are standing in that moment. 300 million years is an almost impossible number to hold in your head all at once. And yet in that specific moment, The distance between now and then must have felt, if only briefly, remarkably thin. News of the discovery did not stay contained to a single scientific journal for very long either. Within days, the story had travelled through newspapers and websites across several different countries, illustrations of that finely reconstructed head appearing beside headlines that for one brief stretch made an ancient armoured myriapod something people were actually discussing over their morning coffee. Museums that had displayed this creature for decades quietly updated their signage. Textbooks due for their next printing made careful, quiet corrections. There is something quietly satisfying about that, at least to me. A mystery patient enough to wait 170 years for its answer still managed the very moment that answer finally arrived to capture the attention of an entire modern world scrolling past it on a phone screen, if only for a few scattered days before the next headline came along to take its place. Here is a question worth turning over for yourself while we're on the subject. How many other confident conclusions in how many other corners of science are quietly waiting on nothing more than the right piece of evidence or the right tool to come along and rearrange everything we currently assume to be settled? Somewhere right now, in some field entirely unrelated to ancient armoured giants, that exact same quiet correction is probably already waiting patiently in a drawer, or a hard drive, or a rock nobody has scanned quite carefully enough yet. I do not ask that to undermine science, to be clear. I ask it because I think this particular story captures something rather beautiful about how science actually works, patiently, honestly perfectly willing to be wrong about something for 170 years, provided the correction whenever it finally arrives is built on solid, careful evidence rather than convenient guesswork. Knowing what the mandibles actually looked like tucked safely inside that reconstructed head opens up an entirely different question, one that had been quietly simmering underneath this whole story from the very first moment we met this creature crossing that shallow black pool in the rain. A mouth finally revealed after all this time is not simply an anatomical curiosity. It is a direct clue toward the single most basic question anyone could possibly ask about a living creature. What exactly was it built to eat? For 170 years that question sat mostly unanswered, filled in with reasonable guesswork borrowed from its smaller modern relatives. Now for the first time researchers finally had something firmer to examine: actual mouth parts, actual structure sitting there in careful three-dimensional detail, ready to be compared against every assumption anyone had ever quietly made about how this armoured giant spent its evenings in that ancient rain-soaked forest. Let me ask you something before we get into what the evidence actually showed. If you had to guess right now, purely on gut instinct, what would you assume an 8-foot-long, heavily armoured creature with dozens of legs and a mouth built for tearing through solid matter was doing every evening in that ancient forest? Most people understandably land somewhere in the neighbourhood of predator. Something built that formidably surely had to be dangerous. That is simply how our brains tend to sort large armoured things into categories, and honestly it is not a bad instinct in most situations. It is just in this particular case almost entirely wrong. I will admit something here, since we've spent so many evenings together at this point that it feels only fair. When I first started properly researching this creature, before any of the fossils, before any of the actual mandible structure, my own gut reaction landed in exactly the same place yours probably just did. Something that size wrapped in that much armour felt like it belonged in the same mental drawer as a scorpion or a wasp, something you would want considerable distance from if you happened to stumble across it in the dark. The evidence, once I actually sat down with it properly, told a rather different and honestly far gentler story. Inside that reconstructed head, sitting patiently behind those newly revealed mandibles, researchers found none of the equipment you would expect from something built to hunt. No venom fangs, the kind you would find on a scorpion or a centipede's front legs, ready to inject something paralyzing into unsuspecting prey. No specialized grasping limbs adapted for snatching, holding, or subduing anything struggling to get away. The legs themselves, examined carefully across every recovered specimen, appear built almost entirely for one purpose: moving a heavy body steadily across solid ground, rather than lunging, striking, or wrestling anything into submission. Here is a comparison worth sitting with because I think it captures the mismatch nicely. Picture a professional boxer's glove sitting beside a pair of thick, sturdy work boots. Both are built from tough material, both look serious enough at first glance capable of doing real damage if you knew nothing about their actual purpose. And yet only one of them was ever designed with a fight in mind. The other exists purely to carry weight, absorb impact, and keep going, step after ordinary step, through mud, over roots, across whatever uneven ground happens to be underfoot that particular day. The mandibles and limbs pulled from this creature's fossilized remains look considerably nearer to the work boots. Built to carry weight, built to endure. Not remotely built for combat, no matter how intimidating the overall silhouette might suggest to someone glimpsing it for the first time. So what then was that formidable-looking mouth actually doing every single evening? The most consistent evidence points towards something considerably less dramatic than the monster your first instinct might have reached for. The structure of the mandibles closely resembles what you would find in modern millipedes, tools shaped for grinding, not tearing, ridged and blunt, rather than sharp and hooked, well suited to breaking down tough plant fiber, rotting wood, and the thick matted layer of dead leaves carpeting the floor of that ancient forest. Picture something considerably closer to a set of small patient millstones than a pair of blades working slowly and methodically, rather than snapping shut in a single decisive strike. In other words, the very same soft decomposing meal we watched our giants settle into earlier tonight, patiently working through a pile of fallen leaves near the base of an old tree, appears to have been an entirely accurate scene, not simply a peaceful choice made for the sake of a gentle bedtime story. I do want to be honest with you here though, because the full picture turns out to be a little messier than a single tidy conclusion, and I think an honest storyteller owes you the mess along with the tidy parts. Some researchers examining preserved fossil remains report finding actual fragments of plant material still sitting inside the digestive tract, direct physical evidence supporting exactly the gentle plant-eating picture we have just walked through. Other specialists studying that same category of evidence remain considerably more cautious, pointing out how easily plant debris can end up inside a fossilized body purely through the ordinary process of decay and burial, seeping in from the surrounding sediment after death, whether or not it ever actually passed through a working digestive system while the creature was still alive to use one, proving that something sitting inside a fossil's gut cavity was actually eaten, rather than simply having drifted in afterward through a crack in the exoskeleton, turns out to be a surprisingly difficult thing to establish with total confidence, even with modern imaging technology sitting right there to help. This is not a case of one group being careless and another being careful. It is simply an honest disagreement, the kind that shows up constantly in serious science, between researchers working from the very same limited evidence and reaching reasonably slightly different conclusions about how confidently to interpret it. If you ever come across an article online declaring with total certainty exactly what this creature ate for dinner every night, I would gently encourage a little healthy skepticism. The actual state of the evidence is considerably more careful and considerably more interesting than that kind of tidy headline usually allows for. Have you noticed, by the way, how the most interesting scientific questions rarely resolve into a single clean answer? The moment enough people look closely enough at them, I find that oddly comforting, honestly. Certainty makes for a tidier story. honest uncertainty held carefully rather than either dismissed or exaggerated tends to make for a considerably more truthful one. There is a further wrinkle worth mentioning since we spent time earlier discussing that remarkable fossil pulled from a beach in Northumberland. Remember that this particular specimen turned out to be older than the peak of atmospheric oxygen. Researchers had originally credited for this creature's enormous size. That same timing problem raises an interesting question about diet as well. Growing to such an extraordinary size, especially before the richest oxygen conditions had fully arrived to make the job easier, likely demanded a properly calorie-dense diet, not simply an abundant one. Decaying leaves, nutritious as they can be for a creature built to digest them efficiently, are not always the most calorie-rich option available in a crowded competitive forest. Some researchers have gently floated the possibility that this giant may have supplemented its usual plant-based meals with the occasional opportunistic snack, perhaps a slower-moving invertebrate, perhaps the soft, unprotected body of a small water-bound amphibian too slow or too unlucky to get out of the way in time. Notice, though, exactly what that possibility does and does not suggest. Opportunistic scavenging, taking advantage of something weak dead or simply too slow to escape, is a very different behavior from active predation, deliberately stalking, chasing, and overpowering healthy prey. Plenty of creatures alive today that we would never think to call predators will happily eat a dead insect if one happens to cross their path at the right moment. A woodlouse in your own garden will do exactly that without a single one of us reconsidering whether woodlice deserve to be feared, and a garden snail will just as happily nibble at a dead earthworm. It stumbles across without earning itself a single horror movie appearance because of it. The evidence recovered from this creature's mouth and legs points firmly away from active hunting, while leaving a reasonable amount of room for exactly that kind of quiet, unglamorous opportunism, the same practical flexibility countless patient, slow-moving creatures rely on today when an easy meal happens to present itself, rather than one they ever had to work particularly hard for. Here is a small mistake worth naming directly, since I think it is worth naming plainly rather than simply implying. It is easy when picturing any extinct creature this old, this large, to reach automatically for the most dramatic possible version of its life: fangs, bared, always hunting, always dangerous. That instinct says considerably more about which stories tend to hold our attention than it does about how most animals, ancient or modern, actually spend the overwhelming majority of their time. Most creatures across the entire sprawling history of life on this planet spend most of their days doing something far closer to what our giant was doing that evening in the rain: eating, resting, moving quietly from one patch of food to the next. Drama in the natural world tends to be the rare exception, interrupting an otherwise unremarkable, thoroughly ordinary existence, not the whole of it. Here is where I think this particular chapter of the story earns a moment of real reflection, because it quietly challenges an assumption most of us carry around without ever examining it closely. We tend to treat size and danger as though they travel together automatically. As one number climbs, so must the other. Nature examined honestly, rather than through the lens of whatever monster movie happened to shape our childhood imagination, tells a considerably more complicated story. The largest animal currently alive on this entire planet, a whale stretching well beyond 100 feet, survives almost entirely on some of the smallest creatures in the ocean, filtering tiny drifting organisms through specialized structures built for exactly that purpose, never once needing to chase down anything capable of putting up a genuine fight. The largest land animal walking the earth today spends the vast majority of its waking hours calmly stripping leaves from trees, occasionally trumpeting at something that startled it, and otherwise posing very little direct threat to much of anything nearby. Even the giant panda built with the jaw strength and claws of a proper carnivore spends nearly its entire day sitting quietly among bamboo stalks, chewing through plant fiber, with an almost comical amount of patience for an animal so thoroughly equipped to hunt if it ever felt the slightest inclination to. If pandas can spend their entire lives politely ignoring the hunting equipment evolution handed them, it should not feel like too great a stretch to imagine our own giant doing something rather similar, armor and all. Enormous size again and again throughout the actual history of a life on this planet correlates considerably more reliably with a calm plant-based energy-efficient lifestyle than with claws, venom, or any dramatic taste for hunting. Why then do we keep defaulting to the opposite assumption? I suspect it says rather more about us than it does about biology itself. Fear responds instinctively to scale long before logic gets a proper turn to weigh in. Something considerably larger than us triggers an old deeply wired alarm regardless of what that creature actually happens to eat for dinner. It is a useful instinct most of the time out in the actual wild, where hesitating to properly assess a genuine threat could cost you dearly. It is a considerably less reliable guide when trying to reconstruct the quiet, ordinary habits of a creature that has been extinct for nearly 300 million years and cannot exactly clear up the misunderstanding itself. Does it change how you picture that evening in the rain? Knowing all of this, I hope it does at least a little. Not because the creature suddenly becomes less impressive, stripped of any imagined menace. If anything, I find the opposite true. An animal this large, this successful, ruling an entire forest for tens of millions of years, without a single fang or claw to its name, strikes me as considerably more remarkable than a simple armored predator would have been. Being enormous and entirely harmless by choice or by design and still thriving that thoroughly for that long is its own quiet kind of accomplishment, one that rarely gets the credit dramatic size usually earns by default. There is a tidy piece of evolutionary logic sitting quietly underneath all of this if you look for it. Weapons are expensive to build and expensive to maintain, biologically speaking, demanding energy resources and constant upkeep that could otherwise go towards simply growing larger or reproducing more successfully. A creature that never needs to fight for its food and that nothing in its own environment is bothering to hunt in return has remarkably little evolutionary pressure ever pushing it toward developing venom claws or speed in the first place. Peacefulness in this particular case was not some accident layered on top of an otherwise dangerous creature. It was very likely the entire point, the natural logical outcome of spending tens of millions of years in a forest with nothing worth fighting and nothing worth fearing. Sometimes the gentlest explanation really is the correct one, and I happen to think that is a rather comforting thought to carry with you toward the end of a long evening. Let's return for a moment to that image of our giant crossing the shallow black pool in the rain, unhurried, patient, settling into a pile of soft rotting leaves without a single trace of urgency. Everything the mandibles and legs have quietly revealed suggests that scene was not softened for the sake of a gentle bedtime story. It was as best anyone can currently determine simply an accurate evening. A truly enormous creature wrapped from head to tail in intimidating armor, going about one of the least dramatic activities imaginable, eating, slowly digesting patiently, and posing considerably less danger to its neighbors than its sheer size alone would ever cause you to assume at first glance. That said, an accurate diet only tells part of the story of how this creature actually lived. Its life moved through its world and left behind the evidence that eventually let us reconstruct any of this in the first place. Knowing what it likely ate raises an equally interesting question sitting right alongside it. With legs built for steady, patient movement, rather than sudden bursts of speed, how exactly did something this large, this heavy, actually get around day after day across ground that would have swallowed a less carefully built creature within a few short steps. The forest floor left behind its own quiet record of exactly that question, pressed patiently into ancient mud, still waiting for us to properly walk through it together. A body fossil, no matter how complete, only ever tells you what something was. It takes an entirely different kind of evidence to tell you what something was actually doing on one particular afternoon, hundreds of millions of years before anyone existed who might have thought to write it down. That second kind of evidence exists too, scattered across ancient riverbeds and old quarry walls on more continents than you might expect, and it turns out to be some of the most personal, oddly intimate proof this creature ever left behind. Think about what a footprint actually is for a moment, stripped of everything else surrounding it. Not a body, not even a piece of one, simply a record of contact, a single fleeting moment where something living pressed down against something soft, and the ground happened to remember it long after everything else about that particular day had been forgotten by the rest of the universe. There is something quietly moving about that, at least to me, evidence of a life built entirely out of absence, out of the exact shape left behind once the creature that made it had already wandered off decades or centuries or millions of years beyond anyone's ability to follow. You have almost certainly left a footprint somewhere yourself this week without giving it a second thought, on a beach in fresh snow across a muddy trail, never once imagining that record might somehow outlast you. Under exactly the right rare conditions it could. We're talking about footprints, not a single isolated print either, but long deliberate trails pressed into soft mud or sand roughly 300 million years ago, then buried, hardened and preserved, well enough that geologists can still trace the exact path a specific individual walked on one particular ordinary day of its life. Here is a small, satisfying piece of scientific tidiness. These trackways even carry their own proper name, Diplycnites quithensis, essentially meaning something near double tracks, a nod to the two parallel rows of paired footfalls running alongside each other wherever this creature happened to walk. Once you know what you're looking at, the pattern becomes almost impossible to mistake for anything else. Two long rhythmic lines of prints evenly spaced, running for meters at a time across old riverbeds in Scotland, Kentucky, Nova Scotia and New Mexico, an ocean apart from each other today, though considerably closer together back when this creature was alive, and the continents themselves had not yet finished drifting into their current arrangement. One cluster of a dozen separate trackways, all preserved on a single bedding plane in Scotland, gave researchers something even more useful than a single measurement. By comparing the spacing and width across every individual trail on that one surface, they could estimate the actual range of body sizes represented everything from smaller individuals, roughly 3 feet long, up to considerably larger ones stretching past 5 feet, all apparently sharing the very same stretch of riverbank at some point, whether on the very same afternoon or simply passing through across a span of several seasons. A whole population, in other words, quietly captured mid-stride of every size between hatchling and confident adult. Here is where the story briefly repeats a pattern you may have already started to notice tonight. Long before anyone properly understood what left these tracks, a 19th century naturalist examining early examples from Nova Scotia, sometime in the 1870s, proposed with total sincerity that they had been made by a fish walking awkwardly through shallow water on a set of stiff, spiny fins. Not a myriapod, not anything remotely resembling the giant we've spent the whole evening with. A confused fin-walking fish dragging itself across the mud in a manner nobody has ever actually observed a fish doing before or since in the entire recorded history of anyone watching fish closely. To be fair to that naturalist, this was still fairly early in the whole business of reading trace fossils properly, and a set of paired rhythmic prints, honestly could belong to any number of creatures if you had nothing else nearby to compare them against. It would take considerably more evidence gathered from considerably more locations before researchers felt confident enough to correctly connect these tracks to the very same armored giant already sitting, half understood in scattered fragments across museum collections on 2 different continents. Does that pattern feel familiar by now? A misidentified worm, a misidentified fish. This particular creature appears to have spent the better part of 2 centuries being mistaken for almost everything, except exactly what it actually was, as though the truth were simply too strange for anyone's first guess to land anywhere near it. I find something rather charming about that persistence. Honestly, the way reality kept quietly waiting out every wrong guess, until enough evidence finally accumulated to set the record straight. There is a particular kind of mathematics researchers can apply to a good clean trackway that I find quietly delightful, precise enough to sound almost like a magic trick the first time you hear it explained. Measure the length of an individual stride, compare it against the estimated leg length calculated from the width of the trackway itself, and you can arrive at a reasonable estimate of exactly how fast that specific animal was moving. In that specific moment, the same basic principle a detective might use examining footprints at any ordinary crime scene. Applied to this creature, the numbers consistently point toward a slow, unhurried pace. Nothing resembling fast, nothing built for chasing anything down or fleeing from any threat in a sudden panic. A patient, steady amble, exactly the kind of walk you would expect from something that had, as we spent considerable time establishing earlier tonight, absolutely nothing left in that forest worth hurrying for. What trackways offer that even the finest body fossil cannot is something considerably more like a snapshot of behavior rather than simply anatomy. A shed plate tells you what a creature was built like. A trackway tells you what a specific individual was actually doing that specific day, step by patient step. Widen the space between one row of prints and the next, and you can calculate roughly how wide that particular animal's body actually was without needing a single fragment of its actual shell to measure against. Notice the prints curving gently to one side, and you're watching in real time the precise moment a creature separated from us by 300 million years decided to change direction, perhaps to avoid an obstacle, perhaps simply because it felt like it. Researchers examining one particularly well-preserved trackway in Kentucky even noticed a set of prints curving sharply, partway along their length, the individual clearly turning, its stride visibly adjusting step by step as it reoriented itself, caught mid-decision in a moment so ordinary that nobody involved could possibly have known it was being recorded for anyone to study ever. Here is a question worth sitting with for a moment. Have you ever considered how strange it is that we can reconstruct a single specific decision made by a specific individual animal from a choice so mundane it would not register as a memory even to a creature with a mind sophisticated enough to form them? And yet there it sits patiently in stone, an ordinary Tuesday afternoon decision to turn slightly left, still legible after everything else about that particular life has long since disappeared. What do you suppose made it turn a fallen branch in its path most likely, or the simple unremarkable pull toward wherever the next patch of decaying leaves happened to be waiting? We will never know for certain, and there is something oddly satisfying about that too, a small permanent mystery tucked inside an already much larger one. There is one discovery among these trackways that I think deserves considerably more attention than it typically receives, because it moves this whole story somewhere unexpectedly tender. Researchers studying a cluster of trackways along the coast of Scotland, 3 closely associated trails pressed into the very same ancient bedding plain, noticed something unusual. 3 separate trails running parallel to one another with an extra set of footfalls layered oddly across 2 of them, an additional file of prints that did not quite belong to either trackway on its own. At first, the obvious explanation seemed to be exactly what it looked like: 2 or 3 separate individuals simply happening to walk the same general route, at different times their paths crossing by pure coincidence. But the footfalls matched too precisely for that explanation to hold up under closer examination. Every single print lined up side by side, stride for stride, with a consistency that ordinary coincidental crossing simply could not produce. After careful analysis, the most convincing explanation researchers arrived at was not simply 3 animals passing by chance. It was 2 individuals moving together, one partially riding along on the back of the other, their footfalls overlapping in exactly the pattern you would expect from a mating pair walking in careful, matched tandem across the mud. Sit with that for just a moment, because I think it deserves it. Everything else this evening has been reconstructed from armor, from mandibles, from careful measurements of long-dead material, the anatomy of something that no longer exists rather than the life it actually lived. This particular trackway captures something considerably softer, an intimate private moment between 2 living creatures, preserved entirely by accident in mud that happened to harden at exactly the right instant to keep it. 300 million years later, in a quiet corner of Scotland, researchers found themselves examining physical evidence of connection, of continuation of one generation, quietly making certain there would be another to follow it. It is easy across an entire evening spent discussing armor plates and ancient oxygen levels to lose sight of the fact that this was, before anything else, a living creature with its own small private moments that had absolutely nothing to do with size records or scientific mysteries. It courted, it paired off, it walked alongside another of its own kind, matching pace for reasons that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with the same quiet biological pull that has driven every living thing to seek out companionship since long before this particular giant ever existed, and long after it disappeared. That particular trackway, more than any single fossil we have examined tonight, reminds me of exactly that. Trackways settled another lingering question too, one that had quietly followed this creature through every chapter of its scientific history. Did it spend its life mostly in water, wading through swamps, the way you might picture an oversized aquatic creature behaving, or did it properly walk on dry land the way we've been imagining it doing all evening? The sediment surrounding these trackways offers a fairly clear answer. Most were pressed into ground that flooded only occasionally a floodplain near a river channel, rather than a permanent standing swamp dominated by towering club moss trees, rather than open water, meaning this creature spent the bulk of its time walking across solid, if often damp ground, only occasionally crossing through shallow water rather than living submerged in it. Some of these trackways run for a considerable distance across a single slab of rock, long enough to confirm this was not a brief hesitant crossing through unfamiliar wet ground, but an animal moving with the same steady, unbothered confidence across that floodplain that we watched it carry through the rain earlier tonight. Not a creature built for a life spent wading, a creature perfectly capable of dealing with the occasional wet patch, the same way you might step around a puddle on a sidewalk without giving the matter a second thought, then carry on exactly as before. Our rainy forest floor from earlier tonight, it turns out, was a remarkably accurate setting after all. One particular trackway discovered along a stretch of Kentucky roadside cut through ancient rock adds a small but rather wonderful detail to a conversation we had earlier in the evening. Preserved on the very same slab of ancient rock sitting only a short distance from our giant's own prints, researchers identified a second entirely different set of tracks, a footprint left by an early four-legged creature, one of those small water-bound amphibians we spent time discussing earlier, the ones still tethered closely to the swamp's edge, while our armoured giant wandered freely across the drier ground beyond them. Two completely different kinds of life walking across the very same patch of mud, at some point near enough in time to both leave their mark on it, then buried together, preserved together, and rediscovered together hundreds of millions of years later by researchers who had no way of knowing until that exact moment that these two very different neighbours had ever shared the same afternoon. One large armoured patient moving confidently across open ground, one small cautious, permanently hesitant about wandering too far from the water's edge, recorded by pure accident on the very same stretch of ancient riverbank, a single frozen moment capturing exactly the uneven, still developing world we spent time exploring earlier tonight, one kingdom thoroughly established, another still quietly finding its footing at the margins. That single slab of rock, more than almost anything else we've examined tonight, captures something worth sitting with as we get ready to move forward. This was never really a story about one enormous solitary creature moving through an empty world. It was always a shared world crowded with neighbours of every conceivable size and shape, each one leaving behind its own quiet trace. Occasionally, if you are fortunate enough, as a researcher on the very same afternoon, in the very same patch of mud as everybody else, and if one small footprint left by a cautious water-bound amphibian was enough to remind us of that, it seems only fair to spend a little more time properly meeting the rest of the neighbourhood, because our giant dominant, as it was successful as it was, remained very far from the only remarkable creature sharing that particular corner of the ancient world. Picture for a moment standing at the exact centre of that ancient forest, turning slowly in a full circle, taking stock of every single record holder, sharing the same patch of ground with our armoured giant. You would not need to walk very far in any direction before bumping into another creature that in its own particular category was doing something nothing alive today has ever quite matched. This was not simply a forest with one remarkable resident. It was by almost any measure you care to apply a genuine gathering of champions, each one excelling in a completely different, wildly specific way, as though this particular corner of the ancient world had decided for one brief stretch of geological time to see exactly how far it could push every single branch of the animal kingdom at once. Where should we even begin with a neighbourhood this crowded with extremes? I think the honest answer is simply to look in every direction one at a time, the way you might if you had actually wandered into this forest yourself and had nowhere particular you needed to be. Would you have looked up first, drawn toward whatever was making that low, heavy buzzing sound overhead, or down toward whatever was rustling through the leaf litter just out of sight? I suspect most of us would have done exactly what any sensible person does in an unfamiliar place. After dark, glance quickly in every direction at once, and then decided very sensibly to stay perfectly still for a moment. Look up first, since that is where the loudest of them tended to announce themselves. Cutting through the thick humid air above the canopy wings, catching whatever light managed to slip through the leaves, flew something that made even our patient ground-bound giant look almost restrained by comparison. A dragonfly relative, though calling it simply a dragonfly, rather undersells the whole experience with a wingspan stretching well beyond 2 feet wide enough that unfolded it would comfortably cover your entire chest from shoulder to shoulder. Nothing alive today, not a single flying insect anywhere on the planet comes remotely near matching it. Here is where this particular giant and the one we've spent the whole evening with part ways rather sharply, and I think the contrast is worth sitting with. Where our armoured friend spent its evenings patiently working through rotting leaves, wanting nothing to do with a fight. This flying giant was built almost entirely for the opposite purpose, large forward-facing eyes sharp enough to track something moving fast through open air. Legs lined with stiff, backward curving spines, not for walking, but for snatching prey directly out of midair and holding on tight while its powerful jaws finished the job. This was the undisputed apex predator of the open sky, above that forest, hunting other flying insects, the same way a hawk might hunt smaller birds today, striking hard, striking fast, and rarely missing. Its life did not even begin in the air, curiously enough. Like its modern dragonfly relatives, this creature most likely spent its earliest days entirely underwater, an aquatic nymph lurking among submerged roots and decaying plant matter in exactly the kind of quiet flooded pools our giant occasionally waded through on its own evening walks. Two completely different creatures sharing not just a forest, but at certain moments quite possibly the very same shallow pool, one passing patiently through it on its way to a meal, the other lurking silently beneath the surface, waiting for a very different kind of meal to wander near enough to catch. Have you ever watched a dragonfly hover over a garden pond and wondered even briefly what it might be hunting? Multiply that same hunting instinct, that same startling precision in the air, across a wingspan roughly 6 times larger than anything darting around your own backyard, and you start to get a proper sense of what shared the sky with our giant that particular evening. I find it worth pausing on an honest complication here too, since we've made a habit of being straightforward about where the evidence gets messy. For years, the very same oxygen-rich air we discussed at length earlier tonight got credited as the single, tidy explanation for how a flying insect could possibly grow this large. Then researchers found later cousins of this same flying giant considerably later in Earth's history, thriving at similarly enormous sizes during a stretch when atmospheric oxygen had already dropped well below its earlier peak. Rich air clearly helped. It was once again evidently not the whole story. Some researchers now suspect something else was quietly at work in the sky, specifically an almost complete absence of anything else up there capable of contesting the airspace. No birds existed yet to challenge a flying predator this size, no aerial competition whatsoever in any direction for as far as those enormous compound eyes could actually see. There's even a further wrinkle worth mentioning, a kind of quiet arms race, playing out entirely between insects. Some of what this flying giant hunted were themselves considerably large plant-feeding insects with unusual beak-like mouthparts, an entirely separate ancient group that has no direct modern equivalent at all. As the hunted grew larger to better escape capture, the hunter had every reason to grow larger right alongside it, simply to keep catching dinner. An empty sky, much like the empty ground we discussed earlier, appears to have handed this particular creature exactly the same kind of opportunity our own giant enjoyed down below, simply in a completely different dimension of the same forest, with a considerably more competitive twist layered on top of it. Now bring your attention back down to ground level, though not quite as far down as the leaf litter our giant called home. Somewhere along the forest floor, tucked into crevices and beneath fallen branches, lived a creature that would make even a seasoned arachnophobe reconsider ever complaining about a spider in the bathtub again. A scorpion built along exactly the same basic plan you would recognize instantly today. Curved tail, grasping pincers, low profile, built for ambush, except stretched out to nearly the length of your own forearm, heavier, and considerably more confident than anything currently sharing a continent with you. Fossils of this particular giant, recovered from a single remarkable quarry in Scotland, revealed something rather unexpected once researchers examined the eyes closely. Considerably larger, more developed eyes than you would find on any scorpion crawling across a desert tonight, the kind of eyesight built for hunting actively during full daylight, rather than skulking around exclusively after dark the way nearly every modern scorpion prefers. Picture for a moment a creature this size patient and armoured in its own right, not waiting quietly in the shadows for something to wander past, but actively stalking prey across open ground in broad daylight, using properly sharp eyesight to track it down in full view of anything else unfortunate enough to be sharing that patch of forest floor with it at the time. Here is the detail I find most worth sitting with, though, especially set right alongside everything we spent an entire evening establishing about our own gentler giant. This particular scorpion almost certainly killed with venom delivered through a narrow curved stinger built for exactly that purpose, the same basic weapon its smaller modern relatives still carry today. Where our armoured friend wandered its forest completely unarmed, needing nothing beyond patience and a taste for rotting leaves, this considerably smaller, though still enormous by any modern standard, neighbour carried genuine potent weaponry every single day of its life, built specifically for subduing anything unfortunate enough to cross its path. Two giants sharing the very same patch of ancient earth, arriving at two entirely opposite survival strategies, one built around never needing a weapon at all, the other built almost entirely around having one ready at every single moment. Does that contrast surprise you at all? It is easy when a single, especially memorable creature dominates an entire evening of conversation to start assuming its particular strategy for survival must have been the obvious default choice for everything else sharing its world. Nature rarely settles for a single obvious choice when several completely different ones can succeed equally well side by side in the very same patch of forest on the very same afternoon. Smaller neighbours filled in the spaces between these headline record holders, too easy to overlook precisely because nothing about them demanded a superlative of its own. Distant, oversized cousins of the cockroach scuttled through the same leaf litter. Our giant fed from considerably larger than anything you would find scurrying across a kitchen floor tonight, though modest by comparison with everything else we've just discussed. Mayflies far larger than any you've ever swatted away from a porch light drifted above slow-moving water nearby. None of them individually rewrote the record books the way our three headline neighbours did. Together they filled out an ecosystem that was from the smallest crawling scrap of life all the way up to that patrolling apex predator overhead, running at a scale that modern eyes simply are not built to expect. That particular quarry in Scotland, by the way, deserves a proper mention of its own because it represents something considerably rarer than a single spectacular fossil. Ancient volcanic hot springs once bubbled up through that specific patch of ground, mineral-rich water flowing outward and settling into shallow pools nearby, and that same chemistry happened to preserve an entire slice of that ecosystem in remarkable, almost photographic detail. Not just the giant scorpion, but smaller insects, early plants, and several of those small water-bound amphibians we spent considerable time discussing earlier this evening, all captured together layer upon layer, exactly as they existed on one particular ordinary stretch of ancient time. Most fossil sites hand researchers a single puzzle piece at a time patiently gathered across decades from scattered locations. This one unusually generously handed over something closer to an entire finished photograph in one sitting, a genuine, layered snapshot of daily life around an ancient hot spring rather than a single, isolated fragment demanding decades of careful reconstruction before anyone could properly understand it. I like imagining that particular spring on an ordinary afternoon, steam curling faintly off the warm water, small insects gathering at its edges, an amphibian or two, sunning itself nearby and somewhere nearby, patient and watchful, that oversized scorpion waiting for exactly the right moment to make its move. An entire small world functioning quietly, going about its business, with absolutely no awareness that every detail of that particular afternoon would eventually be pulled carefully out of solid rock, examined under bright laboratory lights by creatures with backbones considerably more complicated than anything wandering past that spring at the time. Why, you might reasonably wonder, did this particular stretch of Earth's history produce quite so many outright record holders, scattered across so many completely unrelated branches of the animal kingdom, all thriving within the very same patch of forest at the very same time? We spent considerable time earlier tonight examining the mechanics behind one particular giant's remarkable size. The honest answer, once you widen the lens to take in the whole forest, rather than just our one companion, is that no single explanation ever fully accounts for a phenomenon this widespread. Rich air raised a ceiling that applied broadly across nearly every creature breathing through a similar system. An unusually empty, uncontested world both on the ground as in the open sky above it, removed much of the usual pressure keeping ambitious size in check. And once a handful of species started pushing successfully against those loosened boundaries, an entire ecosystem's worth of predators prey, and everything in between had every practical reason to follow along at a similarly generous scale. I think there is something worth appreciating in that beyond simply cataloguing an impressive list of record holders, an ecosystem properly understood was never really a collection of isolated individuals each chasing their own separate record. It was, and still is today, an entire interconnected community, each member's particular strategy only making sense in relation to everyone else sharing the same patch of ground. Our patient giant could afford to stay gentle precisely because nothing large enough to threaten it existed nearby. The scorpion needed its venom precisely because smaller, faster creatures required an efficient way of being caught. The dragonfly ruled an empty sky precisely because nothing had yet arrived to contest it. Take any single piece out of that particular arrangement, and the whole picture shifts to accommodate the change, the same way it always has in every forest in every era, including the one you happen to be sitting in tonight. Does it strike you as strange, thinking about it now, how differently history remembers each of these particular neighbours? Ask most people to picture a dangerous prehistoric creature, and a scorpion or a fanged predator comes to mind almost instantly, easily slotted into the role of villain. Ask that same person to picture a giant armoured myriapod, and the image more often than not tips straight toward monster as well, purely on the strength of its size, regardless of what the actual evidence has spent this entire evening quietly telling us. Meanwhile, the truly formidable hunter of that particular forest, the one built specifically unmistakably for chasing down and killing other living things, tends to get remembered fondly, almost affectionately, as nothing more dramatic than an oversized, slightly novel dragonfly. It makes you wonder, doesn't it, how differently we might picture this entire era if popular imagination had settled on the scorpion or the dragonfly as its defining symbol, rather than the quiet plant-eating giant we've spent this whole evening getting to know properly. The stories we choose to tell about the deep past say a great deal about which qualities we find worth remembering, and considerably more about us sometimes than about the actual creatures we're supposedly describing. That particular tendency, choosing drama over accuracy whenever the two happen to disagree, turns out to have shaped this creature's reputation for a very long time indeed, and it deserves a proper honest look of its own before this night is through. Here is a small experiment worth trying right now before we go any further. Shut your eyes for just a second, if it is safe to do so, wherever you happen to be, and picture a prehistoric giant bug. Not our specific giant, just the general idea, the first image your mind reaches for the moment those two words land together. I would be willing to guess that whatever showed up was not calm. It probably was not patient or gentle or particularly interested in a quiet meal of rotting leaves. It probably had something bearing down at you, backlit, dramatic, ready to strike, maybe with a low menacing sound effect playing somewhere in the background of your imagination, even though nothing about that sound effect ever came from an actual insect fossil. Try the same experiment once more if you're willing, only this time picture a prehistoric giant bug, specifically described to you as gentle, patient, harmless. Notice how much effort that second image actually takes, compared with how instantly the first one arrived. That gap between effort and instinct tells you almost everything you need to know about where tonight's particular chapter is headed. That reflex is not really your fault, and I want to say that plainly before we go digging into where it came from. It is closer to something that got quietly installed in most of us. One thumbnail, one dramatic narration, one ominous documentary soundtrack at a time across an entire lifetime of half-remembered nature specials and museum dioramas, long before any of us ever had the chance to sit down and properly examine the actual evidence, the way we've spent this whole evening doing together. Let's talk honestly about where that installed reflex actually comes from, because I think the answer is considerably more interesting and considerably less sinister than simply blaming careless storytellers somewhere for getting it wrong. Picture for a moment the position an illustrator sits in when asked to bring an extinct creature back to life for a magazine cover, a museum wall, or a documentary segment. They're rarely handed a complete, unambiguous picture to work from. Far more often, as we spent this entire evening discovering firsthand, they are handed a handful of broken plates, a partial trackway, an educated guess wrapped around a stubborn gap where a face should be. Faced with that much genuine uncertainty, and a deadline that rarely allows for 170 years of patient waiting, most illustrators reach understandably for whatever interpretation reads as most visually striking. Not because they are trying to deceive anyone, simply because ambiguous evidence rendered on a page or a screen has to resolve into something, and drama tends to be considerably easier to render convincingly than quiet, ordinary patience. Think about the practical reality of that job for a moment. Nobody commissions an illustration and asks specifically for boring. Editors want something that stops a reader mid-scroll. Museums want something that justifies the cost of an admission ticket. None of that is dishonest exactly, but it does quietly tilt the scales, project after project, decade after decade, toward whichever interpretation happens, to look most impressive, pinned up on a wall, or splashed across a headline, regardless of how carefully worded the actual accompanying research paper underneath it happened to be. Here is a question worth turning over for yourself. If you were the one holding the pencil, staring at a handful of ancient armor plates, and absolutely nothing else, which version would you have been more tempted to draw, the one snarling toward the viewer, or the one quietly nosing through a pile of dead leaves? I suspect most of us honestly would have leaned at least a little toward the snarl. It photographs better. It holds attention longer. It simply feels like a more satisfying way to fill an empty page. This particular pattern is far from unique to our giant tonight, by the way, which I think is worth mentioning because it helps explain why the reflex feels so automatic, rather than personally aimed at this one creature. Even some of the most famous prehistoric animals ever reconstructed, creatures far better, studied, far more completely preserved, with entire complete skeletons sitting in museum halls around the world, spent decades being drawn, standing upright, tails dragging heavily along the ground, posed less like a living, functioning animal, and more like a monument built specifically to loom over a terrified crowd. It made for a wonderful silhouette. It also happened to be biomechanically almost impossible, the kind of posture that would have made walking, let alone hunting, a genuine daily struggle for an animal that size. Considerably more careful research gathered slowly across generations of patient scientists studying tail vertebrae muscle attachment points and the actual physics of balancing an enormous body over two legs, eventually corrected that posture entirely. Tail held level body, balanced horizontally, walking with a poise closer to an enormous bird than a lumbering upright horror. The science moved on carefully, methodically, exactly the way it has moved on tonight regarding our own particular giant. A great deal of popular imagination tucked comfortably into toy shelves and children's books everywhere took considerably longer to catch up, and in some corners arguably still has not finished catching up even now, decades after the correction was first properly established. Does that surprise you at all that even creatures with mountains of careful, painstaking research behind them still struggle to shake an old dramatic first impression? I find it strangely reassuring, honestly. It means the gap between what science knows and what popular imagination pictures is not really about this one particular giant failing to get its due credit. It is simply how the whole system tends to work every single time, across nearly every extinct creature ever handed over to public imagination, before the careful research had a proper chance to finish speaking. There is a further layer worth being honest about too, one that has less to do with illustrators and considerably more to do with simple economics. A calm, accurate headline describing a peaceful plant-eating giant tends to travel considerably less far than a dramatic one promising monsters danger or a creature capable of devouring you whole. This is not a flattering thing to admit about how information spreads, but I think pretending otherwise would be a disservice to you sitting here trusting me to tell you the truth about this whole story, careful science and messy human tendencies included. Attention, more often than any of us would probably like to admit, rewards the exaggerated version over the accurate one, and creatures that cannot exactly issue a correction on their own behalf tend to simply absorb whatever reputation gets handed to them, fair or not. You have almost certainly felt the pull of this exact same mechanism yourself, somewhere considerably nearer to home than an ancient coal forest. Two headlines describing the very same ordinary piece of news, one calm and precise, the other stretched just slightly toward alarm or wonder, and you already know without needing to be told which one your own thumb would more likely stop scrolling for. That is not a flaw unique to you or to me or to anyone in particular. It is simply how attention has always worked long before headlines existed at all, and it applies just as easily to a 300-million-year-old myriapod as it does to whatever story happened to catch your eye earlier today. None of this means every dramatic headline is automatically wrong to be fair, or that every calm one is automatically trustworthy. It simply means the drama itself tells you nothing reliable about the underlying accuracy one way or the other. The only real way to tell the difference tonight or any other night is doing exactly what we've spent this whole evening practicing together, patiently checking the actual evidence against whatever impression first arrived, and being willing to sit with an answer quieter than the one you originally expected. I want to be careful here though, because there is an entirely different mistake sitting right on the other side of this one, equally worth avoiding. Overcorrecting a dramatic myth by insisting a creature was harmless, cuddly, entirely without teeth, in any sense of the word, risks flattening something remarkable into something merely cute, and that misses the actual point just as badly as the monster version did. Our giant was not harmless because it was weak, or small, or unremarkable. It was harmless as best the evidence currently suggests, while still being the largest land invertebrate the planet has ever produced, wrapped in armour substantial enough to make nearly everything else in that forest think twice before testing it. Gentle and properly impressive are not opposites. This particular creature examined honestly manages to be both at once, and I think that combination deserves considerably more respect than either the monster version or an oversimplified, harmless cartoon ever quite manages to capture. There is a particular kind of laziness, if I am being completely honest, in either extreme. Painting something as a mindless monster requires no real curiosity about what it actually was. Painting it as a harmless, cuddly cartoon requires almost exactly the same lack of curiosity, simply pointed in the opposite direction. The considerably harder, considerably more rewarding option, the one we've spent this entire evening attempting together, is sitting patiently with the actual complexity, a creature truly enormous, truly successful, and truly peaceful, all at the very same time without needing to sand any single one of those qualities down to make the other two feel more comfortable. Complexity rarely trends. It tends instead to simply sit there patiently waiting for someone curious enough to give it a proper hour of their evening. Here is a small personal admission, since I think it is only fair given how much time we have spent together tonight. Even putting this very story together, choosing which details to linger on, which images to build for you, involved a genuine ongoing decision about tone. It would have been entirely possible to tell you this exact same factually accurate story while still leaning hard into every dramatic angle available, the size, the armor, the sheer unfamiliarity of an entire world ruled by creatures without a single bone among them. Every fact I have shared with you tonight would still be true told that way. The feeling sitting underneath it would be almost entirely different. I chose deliberately to lean instead toward patience, toward quiet detail, toward letting an honestly gentle creature simply be exactly what the evidence suggests it was. That too is a choice about how to tell a true story, and I think it is worth naming honestly rather than pretending. Every storyteller, myself very much included tonight, is simply a neutral, invisible conduit for pure, unfiltered fact. We all make that choice every single time we decide how to describe something unfamiliar to someone else, whether we're aware of making it or not. The only real difference between a careful storyteller and a careless one is whether that choice gets made openly with the underlying evidence still fully intact underneath it, or quietly at the evidence's expense simply because the dramatic version happened to be easier to reach for. So here is the small practical lesson. I think this particular chapter of the story leaves us with one that reaches considerably further than this one creature, or even this one evening. The next time something ancient or unfamiliar, or simply large enough to trigger that old wired-in alarm crosses your attention, whether in a documentary, a headline, or a stray thought, crossing your mind at an inconvenient hour, it might be worth pausing for just a moment longer than usual. Ask gently what the actual evidence happens to say separate from whatever image reflexively arrived first. Ask it the way we asked it together tonight, one honest question at a time. What does the mouth actually look like rather than what does the size suggest? What do the legs seem built for rather than what would make the best possible thumbnail? It costs nothing more than a moment of patience, the very same patience our own giant apparently had in abundance, and it tends to carry you somewhere considerably more interesting than the reflexive first answer usually manages on its own. Sometimes the honest answer really will be dangerous. Very often, as we spent this whole evening discovering together, it turns out to be something considerably quieter, considerably more patient, and in its own understated way, a good deal more remarkable than the monster version ever managed to be. For all this creature managed to survive, though every misidentification, every dramatic mislabeling, every century spent being quietly misunderstood. One particular chapter of its story was not a matter of misunderstanding at all. It was a genuine permanent ending, and unlike everything else we have carefully corrected tonight, this particular part of the story does not have a gentler, more accurate version waiting underneath it, ready to be uncovered by one more careful scan or one more lucky boulder splitting open on a beach somewhere. This giant, along with nearly everything else we met sharing that remarkable forest, The flying predator ruling the open sky, the venomous hunter patrolling the forest floor, the small water-bound amphibians still tethered nervously to the swamp's edge, eventually disappeared from the world entirely. Not through any single dramatic catastrophe striking all at once, the way popular imagination might prefer to picture an ending this significant. Something quieter, slower, and in its own way considerably more unsettling unfolded instead. And the reason why turns out to be intimately, almost poetically connected to the very same air that made this whole extraordinary story possible in the first place. Nothing about the ending we're about to walk through together arrived the way endings typically do in the kinds of stories built for dramatic effect. No sudden flash. No single catastrophic afternoon that any creature caught in the middle of it could have possibly recognized as the beginning of the end. What actually happened unfolded across a stretch of time so vast that a single lifetime, even a long one, would have registered almost nothing of the change at all. Only the accumulated weight of many, many lifetimes stacked one on top of another across an almost unthinkable stretch of years eventually added up to something as final as an entire way of life quietly closing its doors. I want to be gentle with this particular part of the story if that is all right with you. Not because the truth needs softening, but because I think an ending, this slow, this quiet, deserves to be told at exactly the pace it actually happened, rather than rushed toward for the sake of a dramatic finish. So let's take our time here the same way that ancient forest itself was given more time than any of us can properly hold in our heads at once, before anything about its ending became clear to whatever was still living through it. It started as best researchers can currently piece together with rain. Or rather, with rain slowly becoming considerably less reliable than it had been for the tens of millions of years our giant and its countless neighbours had spent thriving beneath it. Remember that enormous drifting landmass we discussed earlier tonight, the one carrying our rain-soaked coal forest, steadily along toward the shape of a map you might actually recognize today. By this particular point in the story, those drifting pieces of earth had continued pressing together, joining into an increasingly vast, increasingly continuous stretch of unified land. And a land mass that large carries a rather inconvenient consequence along with it. Moisture drifting in from the surrounding ocean simply cannot reach every corner of a continent that enormous. Coastal regions kept their rain reasonably well. The deep interior, far removed from any coastline, gradually stops receiving the steady, near-constant rainfall that a forest built entirely around permanent dampness absolutely depends on to survive. Instead of one long, unbroken wet season stretching across the entire calendar, the way our giant had always known it, the climate began settling into something considerably more familiar to you and me. Distinct wet and dry seasons with real, sometimes lengthy stretches of the year when rain simply did not arrive at all. Picture it happening the way climate actually tends to shift, not through any dramatic single storm arriving to announce the change, but through one slightly drier season, stretching a little longer than the one before it, then another, so gradually that nothing alive at the time could have properly named what it was actually witnessing. A forest that had known nothing but rain for longer than any individual creature's entire evolutionary memory began patch by patch to run short of exactly the one resource it had never once needed to plan around. Here is a question worth sitting with for a moment, even though nobody who actually lived through it could ever answer it for us. What does it feel like, do you suppose, to be perfectly built for a world that is quietly, slowly stopping being that world anymore without a single sign posted anywhere, warning you that the rules were changing? I do not ask that to make the story feel heavier than it needs to be. I ask it because I think there is something worth sitting with, in the fact that change this significant so rarely announces itself clearly enough for anyone caught inside it to properly notice in time. The forest did not vanish everywhere at once, which I think matters for understanding exactly how this story actually played out. Instead, it fragmented, breaking apart into scattered, shrinking pockets of the old humid world researchers sometimes describe quite fittingly as islands surrounded not by open water, but by increasingly dry, increasingly unfamiliar terrain that the old forest dwellers were never built to cross. Picture a map slowly redrawing itself over millions of years, the deep unbroken green gradually giving way at its edges patch by patch, until what remained looked less like a single continuous kingdom, and more like a scattered handful of remaining strongholds, each one separated from the next by ground that had simply stopped being hospitable. Our giant and nearly everything else dependent on that same constant dampness found its available territory quietly shrinking generation after generation, retreating into smaller and smaller isolated refuges as the drier ground between them slowly spread. Think back for a moment to everything we spent considerable time establishing about why our particular giant needed that dampness so badly in the first place. A diet built almost entirely around decaying moisture-heavy plant matter, the kind that simply stops forming in any real abundance the moment a forest stops staying wet. A body that likely depended on a humid surrounding environment to keep its rather delicate breathing pores functioning properly, the same small, quietly essential openings we examined earlier tonight. A reproductive cycle very probably tied closely to consistently damp ground, the way so many of its smaller modern relatives still require today. Every single adaptation that had made this creature so remarkably successful for tens of millions of years turned out to be quietly, specifically built around a world that was no longer reliably available to it. There is something worth naming honestly here, and I think it deserves more attention than it usually receives in stories like this one. Being exceptionally well suited to one particular world is not the same thing as being resilient. Sometimes it is almost the opposite. The very same specialization that let our giant grow larger than any land invertebrate before, or since, that let it dominate an entire forest for tens of millions of years without a single rival worth mentioning, also meant it had remarkably little flexibility left over for a world that no longer matched the one it had been so perfectly built for. It is a pattern worth carrying with you well beyond tonight, honestly, far beyond one particular ancient forest. The creatures, the businesses, the habits, even the people who fit their surroundings most perfectly, are not always the ones best positioned to handle those surroundings eventually shifting underneath them. There is real value in fitting your world beautifully. There is a separate, quieter kind of value in keeping just enough flexibility in reserve that a changing world does not catch you with absolutely nothing left to adapt with. Our giant, magnificent as it was, appears to have spent every available resource on the first kind of value, and had precious little of the second kind left over when it eventually turned out to matter most. I will not pretend the parallel to our own moment stops there either, though I want to raise it gently rather than turn this particular evening into a lecture. Every living thing alive today, ourselves very much included, exists within a climate quietly shifting underneath it in ways most of us will only properly notice looking backward, the same way this ancient forest's own residents likely experienced their own slow unravelling. I do not say that to alarm you before sleep, only to notice quietly that this is not simply a story about something that happened once long ago to creatures entirely unlike us. It is a pattern life keeps returning to in one form or another, And there is something worth sitting with in recognizing that even briefly before we let the thought rest for the night alongside everything else. While all of this was quietly unfolding on the ground, the very air itself, the same rich, generous atmosphere that had made such extraordinary size possible in the first place, was also beginning its own slow retreat. From the extraordinary highs we spent an entire evening examining earlier, oxygen levels having climbed to their remarkable Carboniferous peak, began a long, gradual decline across the millions of years that followed, easing the very ceiling that had allowed our giant and its flying venomous and considerably smaller neighbours to grow so far beyond what their own basic biology could otherwise have supported. Remember that invisible glass lid we spent so much time discussing, the one lifted higher by richer air? As that air slowly grew thinner again, the lid began quietly lowering itself back down generation after generation, nudging the maximum possible size of nearly everything breathing through that same delicate, branching system back towards something considerably more modest. Shrinking habitat on the ground, a slowly lowering ceiling in the air above it, two entirely separate pressures arriving from two completely different directions, quietly working against exactly the same creature at exactly the same stretch of history. I want to be careful, though, not to hand you an overly tidy single-cause explanation here, since we've made rather a habit tonight of resisting those wherever the evidence properly resists them too. This was never a story with one clean villain. It was several slow, patient pressures arriving from different directions, compounding quietly against one another, until an animal built magnificently for one particular version of the world simply had nowhere left broad enough to keep being exactly what it had always been. Here is where the story takes an unexpected, almost gently poetic turn, one I find properly worth lingering on. Remember that small, unassuming creature we spent considerable time with earlier tonight, the very first true reptile barely longer than your forearm discovered fossilized inside a hollow rotted tree stump on the coast of what is now Nova Scotia. That particular lineage carried with it one crucial advantage our own giant never needed, and so never developed across its entire tens of millions of years of dominance. An egg that did not require standing water to survive, protected instead by its own tough, resilient shell, capable of being laid safely on dry ground and still hatching successfully. As the old humid forest fragmented into shrinking isolated pockets, that particular advantage largely irrelevant during the wetter, more forgiving stretches of earlier Carboniferous history suddenly mattered enormously. Creatures no longer tethered to permanent water could spread across exactly the kind of drier, increasingly common terrain that was actively closing in on our own giant's shrinking territory. Land that our giant could no longer comfortably use became almost overnight in evolutionary terms wide open territory for something considerably smaller, considerably less dramatic to look at, but considerably better equipped for exactly the world that was quietly settling into place. The very same climate shift that slowly ended one extraordinary reign quietly opened the door for another lineage entirely, one that would eventually give rise to nearly every reptile, bird, and mammal, including the very audience listening to this story right now, tucked in somewhere warm tonight. I do not think that is simply a tidy narrative coincidence dropped in for the sake of a satisfying ending. It is as best the actual fossil record can currently tell it about, as near to exactly what happened as this kind of story ever gets. One remarkable era, closing not through any dramatic villain arriving to end it, but through a set of quiet environmental pressures that simply favoured a different set of adaptations than the ones that had worked so beautifully for so long. And somewhere in that same slow, patient transition, the ancestors of everything that would eventually become us were quietly, patiently taking full advantage of an opportunity our own gentle giant never had any particular reason to prepare for. The last confirmed traces of this creature in the fossil record date to the early stretch of the geological period that followed the one we've spent this entire evening exploring, together a final quiet appearance before the trail simply goes cold. No dramatic final specimen marking the occasion, no single fossil anyone can point to and confidently declare the very last of its kind. Simply an absence gradually widening across the rock record until an animal that had once ruled an entire forest without a single serious rival to its name was no longer there at all. I find myself wondering, and I suspect you might too, what that very last generation actually experienced in whatever quiet, shrinking patch of damp forest happened to be their home. Did they notice anything unusual at all? Or did each individual life simply carry on exactly as every life before it had? Patient, unhurried, entirely unaware that the world around it had grown considerably smaller than the one their own ancestors had once confidently called home. There is no way to answer that with any real certainty, and I think that particular uncertainty deserves to sit here quietly rather than being smoothed over with a tidier ending than the evidence can honestly support. Perhaps that is the gentlest way to think about it in the end. Not a tragedy unfolding in slow motion, but simply life doing exactly what life has always done, patiently continuing for as long as the world allowed it to right up until it no longer could. What this particular ending leaves us with, I think, reaches considerably further than one remarkable ancient creature. Extraordinary success built specifically and beautifully around one particular version of the world carries within it a quiet, easily overlooked kind of fragility, one that rarely announces itself until the world underneath it has already started slowly, patiently, to change into something else entirely. And yet, sitting here with you at the very end of this particular story, I find myself less interested in dwelling on the ending itself than in everything the ending quietly made possible afterward, all the way down to this exact evening, this exact conversation, and everyone currently listening to it tucked in somewhere warm. There is still a little more of this story worth telling gently before we let it rest for the night. Let's go back just once more to where all of this actually began tonight. That quiet rain-soaked forest. That single patient giant crossing a shallow black pool in the dark, completely unaware that it was about to become the center of your entire evening. Picture it again now with everything you know sitting quietly behind your eyes this time. The armor that turned out to be built for endurance rather than combat. The mandibles built for grinding leaves rather than tearing flesh. The face that stayed hidden from human eyes for 170 years, and the 2 small stones in a French collection that finally gave it back. Does it look any different to you now compared with the very first time we watched it wander into the dark back before you knew a single one of these details? I hope it does. I hope that same silhouette, unremarkable at first glance, armoured and enormous and quietly unbothered by any of it, now carries just a little more weight than it did at the very start of this evening. The way an old photograph looks different once somebody finally tells you who everyone standing in it actually was. Think about everything that single image was quietly holding without either of us realizing it at the time. Somewhere overhead, though, we could not see it yet, a flying predator with a wingspan wider than your own chest patrolled a sky with nothing else in it capable of challenging it. Somewhere nearby, a scorpion nearly the length of your forearm hunted in broad daylight, with eyes built specifically for exactly that purpose. Somewhere near the water's edge, a small, cautious amphibian kept its distance, waiting patiently for a lineage that would eventually include every reptile, bird, and mammal on this planet to finally get its own proper turn. An entire, crowded, thriving world folded quietly into one calm evening walk through the rain, and neither of us knew any of it yet back when we first met that giant crossing the pool. There is a particular kind of patience running underneath this entire story that I think deserves one last proper moment of appreciation before we let it rest for the night. 170 years is an almost impossible stretch of time to hold in your head all at once. Entire human lifetimes rose and completed themselves, generation folding quietly into generation, while this one particular question, what did this creature's face actually look like, simply sat there patiently unanswered, waiting for the right combination of a lucky fossil, the right piece of equipment, and someone curious enough to finally point the two of them at each other. Nobody rushed it. Nobody forced a premature answer just to settle the matter early. Science at its best turns out to be considerably more comfortable, saying we do not know yet than most of us ever give it credit for, and I think that particular kind of comfortable patience is worth carrying with you well beyond tonight. Consider for a moment everyone who touched this story along the way, without ever getting to see how it properly ended. The confused workers pulling strange ribbed stone out of a German railway cut, convinced they had found some impossible ancient worm. The 19th century naturalists certain those paired tracks belonged to a fish awkwardly wading through shallow water. Samuel Scudder carefully sorting scattered fragments in the 1880s, confident he had correctly placed this creature among the millipedes, never once suspecting a hidden head might eventually complicate that tidy conclusion. None of them were wrong to try. Every single one of them handed the next generation a slightly clearer picture than the one they themselves had inherited, even while being quietly honestly mistaken about some part of the whole. That more than any single discovery might be the truest definition of how this kind of patient, honest science actually works. Think about everything that patience eventually handed us once it finally paid off. Not simply a face, though. That alone would have been remarkable enough on its own. An entire quietly humbling lesson about how easily even careful, well-trained people can end up only halfway right for a century and a half, simply because one crucial piece of evidence had not yet arrived to correct them. A reminder that gentle and remarkable are not opposites, that something can be both enormous and utterly harmless at the very same time, and that the two qualities, far from cancelling each other out, can sit together rather beautifully once you stop assuming they cannot. A small, unexpected window into tenderness too, a mating trackway, pressed into ancient Scottish mud, reminding us that even a creature this ancient, this strange, this difficult to properly picture, still made room in its life for connection, for continuation, for the same quiet pull that has driven nearly everything alive to seek out company since long before anyone was keeping track of any of it. There is a particular kind of comfort, I think, in a creature this size turning out to be entirely without malice. We spend so much of our lives quietly bracing for the worst version of whatever surprises us, and here, patiently across an entire evening, the actual evidence kept gently insisting on the gentler answer instead. Not because the truth needed softening for your sake before bed, simply because that happened to be what the mandibles, the legs, the trackways, and finally the long hidden face all quietly agreed on once anyone bothered to properly ask them. And yet sitting right alongside that same gentle giant, remember an entire forest of considerably less gentle neighbours thrived at exactly the same scale, the venomous hunter patrolling the ground in broad daylight, the apex predator ruling an empty sky above the canopy. Gentleness was never the only successful strategy that particular world had to offer. It was simply one option among several, each one working perfectly well for the creature that happened to choose it. I find something quietly reassuring in that, too honestly, the reminder that an entire ecosystem can hold both the fiercest hunter and the gentlest giant at once comfortably without either one needing to apologize for the strategy it settled on. And underneath all of that, one more lesson, quieter still, the one this particular story left us with right at the very end. Nothing, no matter how successful, no matter how perfectly suited to its own particular moment, gets to stay exactly as it is forever. The same rich air that built a giant eventually thinned. The same endless rain that fed an entire forest eventually grew scarce. And in the space that opened up once that particular chapter finally closed, something else smaller, quieter, considerably less dramatic to look at, found exactly the opening it needed to eventually become every single creature capable of listening to a story like this one tonight yourself, very much included. Here is one small quiet detail worth carrying with you as this particular evening winds down. That entire forest, the one this giant called home for tens of millions of patient years, never really left us completely. Piece by piece, leaf by leaf, it settled, compressed and hardened into the very cold seams that gave this whole geological period its name in the first place. Somewhere in an old fireplace, an antique stove, a power station humming quietly on the edge of some city, a small piece of that exact ancient rainfall, that exact patient forest floor our giant once fed from, is very possibly still being quietly returned to the same sky. It originally came from 300 million years later, in a conversation none of the creatures living through it could have possibly imagined having. Here is something else worth sitting with before we let this particular chapter properly rest. That entire lineage never actually vanished, even though our own particular giant did. Millipedes considerably smaller, considerably less dramatic, still wander through gardens and forest floors on every continent capable of supporting them, quietly continuing the very same patient decomposing work our giant once performed on a considerably grander scale. The next time you happen to notice one curled beneath a stone in your own backyard, unbothered, unhurried, minding its own small, quiet business, you're looking at a distant direct descendant of exactly the same family line that once produced something longer than your own front door is tall. The scale changed considerably. The patient, gentle character running underneath it, as far as the evidence tonight has suggested, appears to have carried through remarkably intact. There is one more thought worth sitting with before we let this particular chapter properly rest. Somewhere out there tonight, in a museum drawer or a quiet stretch of coastline or a block of stone nobody has thought to crack open, yet there is very likely another piece of this exact story, waiting patiently to be found the way the Northumberland fossil waited on that beach for a group of tired researchers to notice it, at exactly the right moment, the way those two small French specimens waited quietly in a drawer for the right piece of equipment to finally reveal what they had been holding on to the entire time. Science is very rarely finished with any story worth telling properly. It simply pauses occasionally for a very long while indeed before picking the thread back up again, whenever the world is finally ready to hand over the next piece. I want to thank you properly for spending this particular evening with me, by the way, before we let everything settle into quiet. Stories like this one only really work with someone patient enough to sit through every careful correction, every honest uncertainty, every small, quiet detail that a flashier version of this same story would have happily skipped past for the sake of moving faster. You gave this creature considerably more than the reputation history has generally handed it. You gave it your actual attention for a proper unhurried stretch of time, and I think that is exactly the kind of attention this particular giant, gentle and enormous and endlessly misunderstood always deserved, and so rarely received. I know evenings like this one are not always easy to come by, somewhere between whatever your day actually demanded of you, and whatever tomorrow is already quietly lining up to demand. In return, you chose to spend a proper stretch of this particular night here instead with a creature that has been extinct for nearly 300 million years, learning about mandibles, mud and armor plates rather than doing any number of other perfectly reasonable things with your time. That choice means more than you probably realize, and it is not one I take for granted tonight or any other night we happen to spend together like this. If tonight's story left you with anything at all, I hope it is this. The next time something ancient or unfamiliar or simply large enough to startle you crosses your path in a headline, a documentary or a stray thought keeping you company right before sleep, I hope you find yourself pausing just for a moment the way we've practiced doing together tonight. Not assuming the dramatic version automatically. Not assuming the tidy, harmless version automatically either. Simply staying curious a little longer than usual, patient enough to let the actual evidence speak first, no matter how long that particular evidence happens to take before it is finally ready to. There are a great many more of these quiet, patient stories still waiting out there, tucked into old riverbeds, old museum drawers nobody has properly opened in decades, each one holding its own small, overlooked correction to whatever version history happened to settle on first. Some of them are stranger than tonight's. A few, I suspect, might turn out to be even gentler. I would love nothing more than to sit with you through another one of them. Some other quiet evening, very soon, lights low, men unhurried, ready to meet whoever or whatever happens to be waiting patiently on the other side of it. If this particular evening gave you something worth carrying forward, even something small, I hope you will come back and share another one of these quiet nights with me before too long. There is always another forgotten corner of this planet's long, patient history worth properly sitting with another misunderstood giant, another quiet mystery that took considerably longer to solve than anyone involved ever expected, another face waiting somewhere in the dark for exactly the right person, with exactly the right patience to finally go looking for it. Until then, rest well. Let this particular forest, this particular giant, this particular quiet 300 million year old evening settle gently into wherever your own mind tends to keep the stories it has decided are worth holding on to. Let the rain keep falling softly somewhere behind your eyes if that image is still sitting there with you. Let that one patient giant keep making its slow, unhurried way back toward whatever quiet corner of the forest it calls home, entirely unaware that an audience it will never meet just spent an entire evening learning to see it properly, armor and mandibles and hidden face and all. There is no rush tonight, and there never really needed to be. Some of the best stories, this one included, only ever properly reveal themselves to the people, patient enough to wait for them. You were patient enough tonight. That is no small thing, and I am glad you are here for every quiet, careful piece of it. Sleep well, whoever and wherever you happen to be tonight. I will be here waiting patiently whenever you're ready for the next one. Good night.